She was 19 and cold. No lease, no car, no spare key, just a canvas tool roll and $18.73 she had saved from washing lunch plates in a diner where the coffee always tasted faintly of metal. And with that money, she bought a Brazier's forge half lost on the inland edge of Georgetown County, South Carolina, in a place that had fallen off county maps by 1987. The roof sagged above the rear room. The brick chimney leaned 3 inches toward the walnut trees. The county had condemned it since 1998 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside an old copper swage, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 70 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Stella Mae Hollis had been leaving her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she knew the geography of rooms by the sounds people made in them. A chair scraped hard meant her mother had come home tired from the clinic. A cupboard shut softly meant there was not much food left and no one wanted to say it. The hollow knock of pipes in the wall meant winter had found the old rental house again, slipping its fingers through the seams beneath the window frames. Stella learned early not to ask for what could not be given. She learned to rinse a spoon and set it carefully on a folded towel as though the house owned only one, because sometimes it nearly did. She learned to stretch soup with potatoes, to darn a sleeve from the inside, to stand still when adult disappointment passed through a room looking for a place to land. The house where she grew up stood outside Conway, not far from a road that carried logging trucks before daylight and church vans on Sunday mornings. It was painted white once, though by Stella's 7th year most of that paint had surrendered to weather, leaving grey wood visible in careful, patient streaks. In spring, ditch lilies crowded the mailbox. In summer, the yard went sandy and bare where her shoes wore paths between the back step, the clothesline and the rusted spigot. She had no brothers, no sisters, and not many toys after the year her mother sold the cedar chest. What she kept were small things, a marble with a blue vein through it, a brass button from a coat that had belonged to no one she knew, a broken awl her grandfather had given her and told her not to throw away, because a tool that had failed once still had shape enough to teach the hand. Her mother, Elise, had once worn her hair pinned up with care, and in Stella's earliest memories there had been brightness in her voice when she sang over dishes. That brightness did not vanish all at once. It thinned. A song became a hum, then breath, then the quiet clink of plates being stacked after dark. Elise worked as a nursing aide in a long, low building where the windows were always lit before sunrise, and she came home with the smell of soap and latex gloves in the cuffs of her sleeves. She loved Stella in the practical ways a weary woman could still manage. She brought home fruit cups from the cafeteria when no one was watching. She rubbed menthol on Stella's chest during fevers. She signed school forms in blue ink with her name pressed so hard into the paper the letters could be felt from the other side. But love, when crowded by fear, can become narrow. Elise did not mean for silence to become her language, but it did. Bills arrived in envelopes with red windows. Men from repair companies stood on the porch with clipboards. The landlord called after 8 and before 9, never at supper, never when there was enough strength to answer well. Stella watched her mother fold inward by degrees, as if every year required her to give up 1 more inch of herself just to keep standing. By the time Stella was 13, Elise had stopped speaking of the future except in terms of rent, weather, and whether the old car would start. The only person who spoke to Stella as though the future still belonged to her was her grandfather, Amos Hollis. He lived 42 minutes away in a cypress-board house near Plantersville, where the Black River bent through the low country and the mornings smelled of wet leaves, iron-rich mud, and pine smoke. Amos had been a sheet metal worker in younger years, but before that he had learnt from his own father the nearly vanished craft of the brazier, the shaping of copper, brass, and tin into vessels meant to carry heat, water, food, work, and worship. He made no large claims about it. He did not call himself an artist. On the sign above his shed door, hand-painted in black letters on a plank of heart pine, it said only Hollis Brazier work, repairs done honest. Every other Saturday, when Elise could spare the gas, she drove Stella to him just after dawn. Stella would climb from the car with sleep still heavy in her face, and Amos would already be standing by the shed with 2 mugs of weak coffee, one mostly milk for her. He wore denim shirts patched at both elbows and kept his white beard trimmed close because, as he told her, Flame had no respect for vanity. His hands were square and darkened by time, with nails kept short and clean. On his left thumb ran a pale crescent scar from a sheet of copper that had slipped 30 years before. Stella liked that scar. It looked to her like a moon that had decided to stay. The shed was never hurried. It had a coal forge with a hood blackened above it, a stump set with stakes, a rack of hammers arranged by face and weight, and a long bench polished where generations of wrists had leaned. Amos taught by doing slowly. He did not allow Stella to strike metal until she could name what the metal wanted. Copper, he said, moved under the hammer when it was softened properly, but it punished pride. Brass carried a memory of every careless blow. Tin was thin-skinned and honest. Heat could help, but heat could also ruin. The work began before the flame, he told her. It began with cleaning the bench, laying out the tools, and deciding that haste would not be welcome inside the door. Their weekend ritual changed with the seasons. In January they annealed copper in the blue dark, watching it pass from dull brown to a soft cherry glow before quenching it in a bucket that hissed like rain on a summer road. In March they patched kettles for neighbors who still used them for cane syrup or stew at church suppers. In June, Amos set Stella to planishing shallow bowls, guiding her wrist until the hammer marks overlapped like fish scales. In October he showed her how to raise a vessel from a flat disc, turning it after each round, lifting the wall by fractions no impatient eye would notice. They ate tomato sandwiches on wax paper at noon, sitting on overturned crates with the shed doors open and the fields gone gold beyond them. Amos did not praise easily, which made his rare words settle deep. When Stella made a seam lie flat without solder flooding the joint, he nodded once and said, "That will hold water." She carried that sentence for weeks. It meant more than good job. It meant the work had become trustworthy. It meant something shaped by her own careful hands could be asked to serve. The sentence she remembered most came one winter morning when she was 15. She had struck too hard on the edge of a copper basin and left a sharp crease where there should have been a patient curve. Stella had set the hammer down too quickly, ashamed enough that she would not look at him. Amos took the basin, ran his thumb along the mark, and put it back in front of her. "Child," he said, "slow is not weak. Slow is exact." He died in late September, just after a storm had taken down 3 pines behind his house. The call came before sunrise. Elise sat on the edge of Stella's bed and placed one hand on the quilt but did not touch her daughter's shoulder. By then Amos had been coughing for months, though he had called it old dust and stubborn lungs. Stella remembered the hospital room less than she remembered the shed afterward, the forge cold, the bucket dry, one hammer left on the bench with its face turned upward, catching a square of afternoon light. There should have been time to sort his things. There was not. A cousin from Florence arrived with papers. A man Stella did not know backed a trailer to the shed. Tools went into boxes without being wrapped. Copper sheets were weighed as scrap. The old sign came down and split when it struck the ground. Stella stood beside the pecan tree with her hands at her sides and watched the shape of her inheritance become a sequence of objects other people could carry away. She kept only what she had hidden in her canvas roll 2 summers earlier with Amos's permission: the broken awl, a chasing hammer with a worn hickory handle, a pair of dividers, 3 stakes wrapped in burlap, and a notebook stained at the corners with flux and coffee. After Amos was buried, Stella's house changed again. Her mother married a man named Warren Pike the following spring. He managed a storage facility by the highway and wore collared shirts with the company name stitched above the pocket. Warren was not a loud man. That would have been easier to name. His displeasure moved through the house like damp through plaster, spreading without a visible edge. He liked blinds lowered in the afternoon because sunlight faded furniture. He liked bills stacked by size. He liked the TV on but conversations brief. He did not strike walls or slam doors. He simply made every room feel borrowed. Warren noticed, cost the way some men notice weather. He saw the milk level, the porch light, the minutes Stella spent in the shower. the thread she used mending her jeans. He spoke of responsibility while tightening jar lids until Elise could not open them. He called Amos's tools junk with a history. When Stella took the canvas roll from beneath her bed and cleaned the hammer by lamplight, Warren stood in the doorway once and watched. "No one pays for old ways anymore," he said. Stella did not answer. She wiped the hammer face with mineral oil, folded the cloth, and put it away. At 18, she worked mornings at the diner and evenings stocking shelves at a discount store. She gave Elise cash when she could. Warren accepted it through her mother, never from Stella's hand. He had a way of making help feel like debt and debt feel like character. The more Stella saved, the more the house seemed to lean toward her pockets. A tire went soft. The electric bill rose. A medical copay appeared on the counter and remained there like a test. By the time she turned 19, Stella had learned to keep only a little money visible and the rest folded inside the lining of her tool roll. Behind a seam she had stitched herself. The eviction did not come with shouting. It came on a Thursday evening in November, with rain tapping the kitchen windows and the smell of boiled cabbage still hanging in the air. Stella came in carrying a paper bag of day-old rolls from the diner. Her shoes were wet through. Warren was seated at the table, and Elise stood at the sink with both hands resting on the edge, though there were no dishes in the basin. On the table lay a brown cardboard box, not a suitcase, not a laundry basket. A box from the storage facility, printed on one side with black letters, "Small files suffice use." Inside it, Warren had placed Stella's folded clothes, her school certificate, a comb, 2 pairs of socks, the photograph of Amos in front of his shed, and the canvas roll tied shut with butcher's twine. Stella looked at the box, then at her mother. Elise's face was turned slightly toward the window, as if something outside had required all of her attention. Warren slid a house key across the table with one finger. It stopped near the salt shaker. "You cannot live under my roof anymore." 8 words, evenly spoken, clean as a cut. Stella waited for her mother to turn. There was enough time for it. The refrigerator clicked on, shuddered, and settled into its low electric hum. Rainwater ran from Stella's coat hem onto the linoleum. Elise lifted one hand from the sink and pressed it flat against her own stomach. She did not look away from the glass. That was the betrayal Stella carried with her, though she never called it that aloud. Not the box, not Warren's voice, not even the key lying there like a returned favor. It was the silence of the woman who had once brought home fruit cups in her coat pockets. The silence of a mother who had taught her child how to endure but not how to be chosen. Stella took the photograph of Amos from the box and slid it inside her coat. She lifted the cardboard with both hands. It was heavier than she expected, because a life always weighs more when someone else has packed it. Outside, the rain was cold enough to hurt. She walked to the diner first because she knew the side door lock was broken. She slept that night in the dry storage room between sacks of flour and a mop bucket, with her coat folded beneath her head and the cardboard box against her ribs. At 4:30, the cook found her there, paused, and then stepped back without speaking. 10 minutes later, he left a biscuit wrapped in foil beside the coffee urn. For 6 weeks, Stella moved in a pattern that was not quite wandering and not quite planned. She spent 2 nights in Conway behind the diner, 3 in the laundry room of an apartment building where the machines ran late and kept the air warm, 1 under the covered picnic shelter at a county park until a patrol car rolled in and she walked away before anyone called her name. She took a bus to Myrtle Beach because someone said seasonal hotels needed cleaners, but the work had ended with the tourist weather. There she slept one night in a church vestibule that smelled of candle wax and wet wool, and another in the waiting room of a bus station where the plastic seats were divided by metal arms to keep bodies from resting too comfortably. Her money diminished by coins and necessity. $2 for coffee when the cold got into her hands, $1.50 for a locker when she needed the tool roll safe while asking after work, $7 for a thrift store sweater, the color of oatmeal. She bought peanut butter, crackers, a tin of sardines, a needle card, and once, when fever made her careless, a paper cup of soup from a counter where the woman serving it pretended not to notice Stella counting nickels twice. From Myrtle Beach, she rode inland toward Florence, then down again through Kingstree, because the bus routes were cheaper when they made less sense. In Florence, she slept behind a laundromat beneath a vent that breathed out warm air until midnight. In Kingstree, an older man at a gas station let her sit near the kerosene heater for an hour and told her the weather would break by Sunday. It did not. A hard rain came instead, silver and relentless. And Stella walked with her cardboard box held under her coat until the box softened at the corners and began to lose its shape. She replaced it with a feed sack given to her by a woman outside a farm supply store. The woman had grey hair braided down her back and a voice made rough by cigarettes. She did not ask Stella why she needed it. She only shook the grain dust from the sack, folded the top twice, and said, "Canvas lasts longer than pride." That sentence stayed near Amos's, not equal to it, but close. By the 5th week, Stella had learned which public libraries opened early, which gas stations locked their restrooms, and which church signs meant the building might have an outdoor outlet where she could charge the phone she no longer had service for. She kept her remaining bills flat inside the notebook from Amos's shed. She wrote expenses in pencil along the margins of old Brazier diagrams because the act of counting made her feel less likely to disappear. December came with a dry cold that made the fields look honest and stripped. Stella reached Georgetown on a Tuesday afternoon, riding the last 30 miles in the back of a delivery van after helping the driver unload crates at a produce stand. The town sat low and weathered near water, with live oaks stretching over streets and old houses holding themselves with a dignity that did not depend on paint. She had never been there before. She had no reason to stay except that she had no reason left to go. The public library stood in a brick building with white columns and a polished brass return slot. Stella entered because her hands had gone numb and because libraries did not ask a person to buy anything before allowing her to sit. Inside, the heat rose gently from floor vents. A Christmas wreath hung near the circulation desk made of magnolia leaves gone glossy and brown at the edges. Stella chose a table near the local history shelves where she could see both the front door and the clock. She meant only to rest. Instead, she found the classified ad in a county surplus notice taped to a corkboard between a tutoring flyer and an announcement for a quilting circle. Abandoned structure, action, former Brazier's forge and workshop, Parcel 14B, Inland, Georgetown County. Minimum bid, $5. Buyer assumes all risk, liens, repairs, and removal obligations. Deed transfer by county clerk upon payment. Demolition pending if unclaimed. The word Brazier stopped her before the price did. At first she only stood there, reading the notice without blinking. The letters had been printed on county paper with a seal pail at the top. Someone had circled the demolition line in red pen. Below it in smaller type was an address Stella did not recognize and a note that bids under $20 would be accepted in person before the end of the week. She read it once more, then again. Former Brazier's forge and workshop. The phrase seemed impossible in the public light of that library. Impossible beside the quilting circle and the tutoring flyer and the neat rack of tax forms. It belonged to Amos's shed, to copper warming under flame, to the patient turning of metal beneath a hammer. She touched the notice with 2 fingers, not to take it down, only to be sure it was paper. A librarian with silver glasses looked up from the desk. "Do you need help with something?" "Honey?" Stella lowered her hand. "Where is the county clerk's office?" The librarian gave directions slowly, then looked at Stella's wet shoes, her feed sack, the canvas roll under her arm. Her face did not change, but she reached into a drawer and wrote the address on the back of an old checkout slip. "They close at 4, she said. "You will want to go in the morning." That night Stella slept behind the library in a recessed doorway where the wind could not reach straight on. She wrapped the tool roll inside her coat and kept the checkout slip in her sock so it would not blow away or soften with damp. The brick held a little of the building's heat until after midnight. Beyond the alley, cars passed on the main street, their tires whispering over cold pavement. Stella did not sleep much. She watched the square of sky above the roofline and listened to the town settle into itself. In the morning, she counted her money on the library bathroom sink after washing her face with cold water. There was enough for the bid, enough for a little food, and not enough for any mistake that required undoing. She flattened the bills beneath her palm. The $5 note was worn almost soft, with a corner taped long before it reached her. She held it apart from the rest and slipped it into the back pocket of her jeans. Travelling to the clerk's office required only walking, but the decision felt longer than any bus ride she had taken. Stella had been moved by other people's choices for so many years that choosing for herself had an unfamiliar weight. A condemned forge was not shelter in any proper sense. It was risk with a roof partly missing. It was responsibility without promise. It was a place the county wanted gone, but it was also a word from her grandfather's world still standing somewhere beyond town, waiting under vines and weather and official neglect. She tied the canvas roll tighter. She folded the classified notice into the back of Amos's notebook. She stepped out of the library and into a morning clear enough to make every edge visible. By noon, she would stand before a clerk who had already warned 3 people away from the property, and by dusk, she would be walking toward the forgotten forge with a deed in her coat pocket and no understanding yet of what had been kept for her inside the copper swage. The bus left Stella at a stop where the shelter had no glass in its side panels, only aluminum ribs and a faded advertisement for a seafood buffet that had closed before she was old enough to work. The driver lowered the door with a sigh of air and did not look back after she stepped down with her feed sack, her canvas roll, and the thin county slip folded twice in her coat pocket. Morning had begun without warmth. A bank sign 2 blocks away blinked 31 Fahrenheit in red numbers, and the wind coming off the river made that number feel careful and exact, as if the cold had been measured by hand. She had slept the previous night in a hay barn 5 miles outside Andrews, after walking farther than she had planned along a road with no shoulder. A woman at a gas station had told her there might be a farmer's shed if she followed the tree line past the old tobacco field, and Stella had found it only after dark, when the moon came through the ribs of the clouds and showed her the broad black shape of the barn against the winter pasture. She did not go inside all at once. She stood at the opening and listened for animals, engines, voices, anything that might mean she was trespassing on someone's patience. There was only the settling of hay, the far bark of a dog, and the dry tick of frozen grass against the boards. Inside, the air held the smell of dust, sweet feed, old rope, and the faint animal warmth that remained in a barn long after the animals had gone elsewhere. She climbed into the loft by a ladder, polished smooth in the center of each rung. Hay scratched the backs of her hands and stuck to her coat. She burrowed down between 2 square bales, set the canvas roll beneath her knees where no one could take it without waking her, and tucked the feed sack under her head. The temperature fell to 27 Fahrenheit before dawn. She knew because the little thermometer nailed to a post at the barn door had a white face and a red needle, and she read it when she climbed down stiff and hungry, her breath leaving her in pale, brief clouds. By the time she reached Georgetown that morning, her left heel had blistered, and the blister had broken. She had walked the last 3 miles slowly along Highway 701, counting mailboxes when counting steps became too much. Trucks passed with a hard rush of air that lifted grit into her cuffs. The marsh opened in silver-brown stretches on one side, with water shining between reeds and the low folded backs of egrets, standing still as if they had been placed there by a careful hand. She had never seen a landscape so flat and so full of hidden motion. It seemed empty until she stood still. Then everything moved. The town received her without welcome or refusal. It simply went on. There was a bakery with flour dust in the lower corners of its front windows and a bell tied to the door with red ribbon. There was a pharmacy called Bellamy Drugs, its green awning striped with mildew at the seams. There was a barber shop with 2 chairs visible through the glass and a cardboard sign offering senior cuts on Tuesdays. There was a narrow cafe with a chalkboard menu leaned against a brick wall, the words Chicken Bog written in a hand that pressed hard on the chalk. There was a hardware store called Weller & Son, though the painted sign had weathered until the ampersand was clearer than either name. Past that stood a florist with buckets of cedar and holly by the entrance, and beside it an office for an insurance agent whose window displayed a ceramic snowman already tilted on its cotton snow. Stella noticed these places not because she had money to enter them, but because naming them steadied her. A town became less frightening when divided into doors, counters, windows, and ordinary errands. Someone was buying bread. Someone was choosing cough syrup. Someone was getting the back of his neck shaved clean. Life did not pause because a girl arrived with everything she owned pressing against one shoulder. The county clerk's office stood inside a brick municipal building with wide steps and iron railings polished by years of hands. The stone above the entrance had been carved in 1936, and the numerals were darkened with dirt in their grooves. A flag moved heavily from a pole near the door. Inside, the heat was dry and close, and the floor shone with a waxed dullness that reflected the overhead lights in long cloudy bars. Stella wiped her shoes as well as she could on the mat before crossing the lobby. A woman behind a glass partition looked up when Stella approached. She had a careful helmet of pale grey hair, narrow shoulders inside a navy cardigan, and a pair of reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain. Her mouth was not unkind, but it had spent years holding back comments until only the shape of restraint remained. On the counter before her sat a brass nameplate rubbed bright at the top edge by dusting. MRS. Evelyn Pritchard, County Clerk. Stella placed the surplus notice beneath the small half-moon opening in the glass. I came about the auction parcel, she said. Mrs. Pritchard did not touch the paper right away. She looked at Stella's coat. The frayed cuff, the feed sack, the canvas roll tied with care. Then she looked down at the notice and drew it toward herself with 2 fingers. That property, she said, has been a nuisance for this office longer than some people have been alive. Yes, ma'am. You are the first person to come in since we lowered the bid. Stella kept her hands folded. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Pritchard sighed through her nose, not with irritation exactly, but with a kind of tired duty. She rose from her chair and disappeared behind a row of metal filing cabinets. Stella heard a drawer open, then another, then the slap of a folder laid on a desk. When the clerk returned, she carried a manila file thick with stapled forms, photographs, notices, and a deed packet held together with a black binder clip. The clerk opened a side door in the partition and said, "Come around. We do not handle condemned transfers through the slot." Stella followed her into a room with 2 chairs, a round table, and walls lined with maps. Some maps were clean and recent, showing parcels in bright printed colour. Others were yellowed and hand-marked, their road names written in ink that had browned with time. The room smelled of toner, paper, and the faint lemon oil used on wooden furniture in public buildings. Mrs. Pritchard sat and motioned for Stella to take the chair opposite her. "You understand?" the clerk began, placing the file between them. "This is not a house ready for dwelling." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county has posted the structure unsafe." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there is no active power account, no water meter, and no inspection certificate." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand that by signing, you accept liens, cleanup, injury risk, weather damage, and the demolition order unless you satisfy the repair conditions." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand that $5 does not buy mercy from a roof beam." Stella looked at her hands. The nails were clean but rough at the edges. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Pritchard studied her for a little while. "Child, I am required to warn you plainly. That place has a collapsed shed wall, a failed chimney crown, animal intrusion, rotten porch boards, and a rear sill that may not survive another wet season. There is a well on the parcel, but nobody in this office will swear to the water. There is an outhouse somewhere behind the tree line, though I would not put my foot in it after dark. The road in is passable in dry weather and miserable after rain. If you buy it, the county will not haul your debris, replace your glass, or send a man to fix what breaks over your head." "Yes,
ma'am."
"You say that as if it solves something." "No, ma'am," Stella said. "It only means I heard you." The clerk's expression changed by half an inch. Not softened. Not yet. But the guarded line of her mouth loosened as if a small latch had been lifted. Do you have identification? Stella took out her state ID, worn at the corners, and slid it across. The clerk copied the information in a square, deliberate hand. Then she turned the deed packet around and marked 3 places with yellow tabs. Stella read as much as she could. Some words had the heavy sound of offices and courts. Assumption, liability, transfer, encumbrance, condemnation. Others were plain enough. Parcel, boundary, structure, payment. The $5 bill came from her back pocket folded lengthwise. She smoothed it once before handing it over. Mrs. Pritchard took it, glanced at the taped corner, and laid it beside a receipt book. From a drawer she removed a brass stamp heavy enough to require both hands. Its handle was black, its base polished by long use. She positioned the deed beneath it, aligned the seal through a small rectangular window, and pressed down. The sound filled the room with finality. Not loud. Final. The raised county mark appeared on the page, crisp and cold beneath Stella's fingertips. Mrs. Pritchard filled out a receipt in duplicate, tore the top sheet along the perforation, and slid it over. Keep that dry. Yes. Ma'am? The clerk placed a road map on the table and circled a route in pencil. You will follow Front Street north until it becomes High Market, then take the county road out toward Plantersville. Here, you turn off before the old rice field. The sign is gone, but there is a leaning mailbox with no door and a pair of walnut trees close together. Do not take the logging road past it. You will think it is the way because it looks wider. It is not. Stella leaned over the map. How far from here? Walking? Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Pritchard's pencil stopped. A little over 7 miles from this building to the lane. Another 1/4 mile in, depending on how much brush has grown back. Stella nodded once. You have someone meeting you? No, ma'am. The clerk looked down at the deed, then at the ID again, and her eyes rested on Stella's last name. For the first time, she did not appear to be measuring the girl's coat or the weather or the risk. She was measuring a memory. Hollis, she said. Stella lifted her eyes. Mrs. Pritchard tapped the ID lightly. There was a Hollis man down in Plantersville who could mend copper so fine you could not find the seam once he was done. My mother had a wash boiler he patched after the bottom thinned. She used it another 12 years. Stella's hand closed under the table around the edge of her coat. He was my grandfather. The clerk sat back. Outside the room, a printer started and stopped. Somewhere in the hall, a man laughed once, then lowered his voice. I wondered, Mrs. Pritchard said. Stella did not know what to answer. There were memories that could not bear being handled in public. She looked at the map instead, at the pencil circle around a place no longer useful to the county. Mrs. Pritchard folded the deed into a large envelope and wrote Stella's name across the front. Her hand, which had seemed purely official before, now moved with an almost private care. That forge belonged to a family named Vale for a long while, she said. Before my time, mostly, people used to bring pans, lanterns, still parts, church vessels, roof flashing, whatever needed honest metalwork. After the highway changed and the younger people left, it closed by degrees. I do not know why the county kept it so long. Places like that get misplaced in paperwork until somebody wants the land cleared. Stella touched the envelope but did not lift it yet. Your grandfather would have known the kind of work they did there, the clerk added. Maybe better than anyone left around here. The words crossed the table and settled without asking permission. Mrs. Pritchard stood, then paused with one hand on the back of her chair. There is one more thing. If the building inspector sees no effort by spring, the demolition order stands. Effort means visible repairs, not wishes. You will need receipts, photographs, and dates. Keep records. County men respect records more than need. Yes, ma'am. And do not sleep beneath that rear roof. Stella glanced up. I'm not asking whether you intend to, the clerk said. I'm telling you where not to place your body. The sentence had the shape of warning, but something inside it resembled care. At the front desk, Mrs. Pritchard took an old grocery bag from beneath the counter and placed the deed envelope inside to protect it from damp. Then she added 2 rubber bands, a pencil, and 3 blank repair log sheets copied from some county form whose title had been blacked out. Stella received them all without speaking for a moment. "Thank you," she said at last. The clerk nodded, then reached into the receipt drawer and tucked Stella's $5 bill beneath the tray rather than into the cash slot. Stella saw it happen but did not understand it. She would not understand until much later that Mrs. Pritchard had decided, for reasons of her own, to keep that particular bill where she could remember the morning someone had paid the county almost nothing for a place everyone else had abandoned. The walk out of town began under a sky the colour of pewter. Stella passed the bakery and did not go in, though the smell of yeast and sugar followed her for half a block. At the cafe, a woman in a green apron was setting a paper menu in the window. She glanced at Stella's feed sack and lifted 2 fingers in greeting. Stella lifted hers back. Past the pharmacy, 2 older men stood near the curb discussing a carburetor, as if the world had narrowed to that one stubborn part. The barbershop door opened and released a brief breath of talcum powder, shaving soap and radio music before closing again. By the time she left the main street, the town thinned into houses set farther apart, some with porch swings chained up for winter, others with oyster shells lining the drive. Live oaks gave way to pine, then to stretches of open land with dormant grass flattened by frost. The county road lifted slightly, then ran straight between ditches where brown water reflected the white sky. Stella kept the grocery bag with the deed inside her coat and held the canvas roll across her shoulder. A black dog appeared near a mailbox shaped like a barn and followed her for nearly a quarter-mile without barking. It walked in the ditch, stopping when she stopped, advancing when she did, its ribs visible beneath a dull coat. Stella did not have food to give it. After a while the dog lost interest or found better business, turning through a gap in a fence where chickens scratched beneath a magnolia tree. She passed a narrow church with peeling white steps and a cemetery behind it, the stones leaning at different angles as if listening to the ground. She passed a shuttered bait shop, a mobile home with blue tarps tied over half its roof, and a field where 3 horses stood nose to tail against the wind. Twice, pickup trucks slowed as they approached her, then moved on. Once an elderly woman in a beige sedan pulled onto the shoulder and asked whether Stella needed a ride. "No, ma'am," Stella said through the open window. "I am close." The woman looked at the feed sack, then at the road ahead. "Close can be farther than it looks." "Yes, ma'am." The woman drove on slowly, not quite satisfied. The walnut trees appeared after the road curved past a stand of longleaf pine. They stood close together on the left side, black-limbed and bare, with last summer's husks scattered beneath them like small dark stones. Between them leaned a mailbox without a door, its red flag rusted in the down position. Behind it, half hidden by privet and yopon, a lane entered the trees. Stella stopped at the mouth of it. The lane was not wide enough for a proper road anymore. 2 tire ruts remained, filled with leaves and pale sand, and a strip of winter weeds grew down the centre. Branches had lowered over it from both sides until the way seemed to narrow with each yard. Not refusing her exactly, but asking whether she understood that entry meant labour, she adjusted the canvas roll and stepped in. The air changed at once. The wind dropped behind the trees, and the sound of the road faded after 20 paces. The lane descended slightly toward lower ground. Underfoot, wet leaves gave way to patches of crushed shell, then to brick fragments buried in moss. A squirrel ran along a fallen limb and stopped to scold her from the safe side of a cedar trunk. Farther in, she saw the remains of a fence, 2 posts still standing, rails gone, wire swallowed by vines. The forge appeared slowly, not as a building revealed all at once, but as pieces gathered by the eye. First the chimney, square and red against the washed sky, with several courses missing at the top and a dark crack running beneath the cap. Then the roof line, low and long, sloped more steeply over the rear room where the sag had begun. Then a front gable with weathered boards silvered by age, and beneath it a sign so faded that the letters could be read only where rain had spared them. The word sons had been scraped by weather until it looked uncertain of itself. The building was smaller than Stella had imagined and larger than she could manage without fear. It measured perhaps 28 feet across the front and 36 feet deep, built with timber framing, hand-planned siding, and a brick foundation that had settled unevenly into the damp ground. The front door stood beneath a shallow porch with 2 posts, one straight and one bowed. The porch boards had curled at their edges. The west wall carried a line of narrow windows, most clouded, 2 broken, one covered from within by something dark. On the east side, a lean-to shed had partly collapsed, its roof resting at an angle on a mound of leaves and rusted tin. The chimney rose from the back room, broad at the base, made for work rather than comfort. It had once served a forge hearth. Stella could see that from its width and from the soot-darkened brick above the rear roof. A patch of old flashing had pulled loose and lifted in the wind with a faint, tired ticking. The gutters were gone except for one short length hanging above the door. Walnut branches reached over the roof and had dropped leaves into every hollow. Stella stood in the yard until the cold found the sweat beneath her coat. There was no grand feeling, no music of arrival, no sudden certainty that she had done right. The building looked tired, and she was tired, and between them lay an amount of work too large to hold in one thought. So she did what her grandfather would have required before flame, before hammer, before any claim of beginning. She looked carefully. The front sill was soft near the left corner. The porch step had split lengthwise but might bear weight if stepped on near the edge. The door hung square enough. The roof sag over the rear room came not from the main ridge but from a failing rafter near the chimney. The windows needed glazing. The foundation stones, though shifted, had not collapsed. Someone had nailed tin over a hole in the siding years before, and the tin had held. A downed limb rested against the east wall, but had not pierced it. She crossed the porch by testing each board before trusting it. The door had an iron latch, cold and rough beneath her fingers. It resisted once, then gave with a swollen scrape against the threshold. The first smell was dust. Not ordinary house dust, but the deep, settled dust of a place closed through many summers, mixed with soot, mouse nests, dry leaves, rust, and a faint mineral sweetness from old metal. Stella stood just inside and let her eyes adjust. Light entered through cracks, through a broken pane, through a gap near the roof where a strip of sky showed pale above the rafters. The front room had been both shop and receiving space. A counter ran along the right wall, its surface scarred by use and warped by damp at one end. Behind it were shelves holding jars, bent nails, paper packets gone soft, and several small tins with labels too faded to read. A chair with one missing rung stood near the cold front window. On the wall hung outlines where tools had once been, darker wood showing the shapes of what absence had preserved. The floorboards groaned but did not fail. Stella moved with her weight spread carefully, placing each foot near joists when she could see the nail lines. Her hand brushed the counter, and dust rose in a thin veil that caught the light. She coughed once into her sleeve. In the corner near the front door lay a stack of old newspapers tied with twine, the top sheet curled and brittle. A calendar remained on the wall, turned to March of some year whose numerals had faded beneath mildew. The picture above the dates showed a field of daffodils bright enough to seem almost rude in that dim room. Beside it, a wooden peg held a cracked leather apron, stiff as bark. Through a wide opening at the rear lay the workroom. Stella stopped before entering. The back room was colder. Its floor was brick near the forge hearth and plank along the sides, a practical division made by people who had understood sparks. The hearth itself occupied most of the rear wall, with a firebox black as night and a hood above it shaped from sheet iron. A hand-cranked blower sat to the left, its wheel rusted but intact. A long bench ran beneath the west windows, and on it rested objects under dust so thick they looked softened, almost cloth-covered. Stakes, mandrels, a vise with a frozen screw, a wooden mallet split at the head, patterns drawn on stiff paper and curled at the edges, a bucket of coal hardened into one dark mass near the hearth. On the far wall, fixed between 2 shelves, hung a broad copper swage block. Greened at the seams, its surface dented and polished in hollows where metal had once been shaped over it. She did not know then to look closer. The roof above the back room showed daylight in 3 places, not wide holes, but enough. One shaft fell directly across the brick floor, bright and narrow, revealing a scatter of acorn shells and the prints of some small animal. The chimney smelled of wet soot. When the wind passed over the broken crown, air moved down through it and stirred ash in the hearth with a whisper like a person turning in sleep. Stella set her feed sack on the front counter and her canvas roll beside it. The room received both without comment. She walked back outside before the light failed, found the well behind the building beneath a square wooden cover weighted with brick, and marked its place without opening it. The outhouse stood farther back, half screened by cane and leaning but upright. Beyond it, the land fell toward a narrow run of water, not a creek exactly, more a black ribbon moving through marsh grass and cypress knees. She gathered fallen branches before dark and stacked them near the front door, though she did not trust the chimney enough for fire. Supper was 2 crackers, the last smear of peanut butter from a jar, and water from the bottle she had filled at the library. She ate sitting on the porch step, careful not to put weight on the split center board. The sky cleared toward evening and the cold sharpened. Somewhere beyond the trees a barred owl called once and then again, each note spaced with patient authority. For the night she chose the front room, away from the rear roof and beneath a section where the rafters still looked true. She swept one corner with a bundle of pine twigs because there was no broom. The dust resisted at first, then gathered in soft grey drifts. She laid flattened newspapers over the boards. Then her coat, then the feed sack folded beneath her head. The canvas tool roll she placed against her chest under one arm, as she had done in the barn. The deed envelope went inside the lining of her coat where body warmth and fear might keep it dry. Dark came differently inside the forge. It did not fall. It thickened. The front window became a pale square, then a grey one, then a place where the night pressed its face against broken glass. The building made sounds as it cooled. A tick from the tin patch. A low complaint from the porch. A faint drip somewhere in the back room, though there had been no rain that day. Mice moved behind the shelves with tiny exact feet. Stella lay still and named what she could hear. Wind, wood, tin, mice, her own breath, the naming helped. Beyond those sounds was the silence of the place, not empty, not kind yet, but deep enough to enter slowly. It did not ask where she had come from. It did not ask why no one had followed. It did not ask what she had done to deserve so little. For the first time in 6 weeks, there was a door between her body and the open road. And though the door was swollen, cracked, and held by one rusted latch, it was closed. Near midnight, the cold woke her. She sat up, pulled the feed sack around her shoulders, and looked through the opening toward the workroom. Moonlight had found the broken rear roof and laid a pale bar across the brick floor. The copper swage on the wall caught that light along one curved edge, a dull green glimmer in the dark. Stella watched it for a long time without knowing why. Then she lowered herself again to the floorboards, one hand resting on the canvas roll, and listened as the building breathed around her. The forge had been waiting. So had she. By the first morning, Stella understood that owning a place and being sheltered by it were not the same kind of possession. The deed in her coat pocket had given her a lawful claim, but the building answered only to weather, gravity, rot, and whatever patience she could bring through the door. She woke with her cheek against the folded feed sack, and one hand gone numb beneath her ribs. The boards below her had stored the night's cold so thoroughly that even after she stood, her bones seemed to remember the floor. She did not begin with sweeping. She began with water. The well behind the forge had a square cover made of weathered cypress boards, grey and furred at the edges. 2 bricks held it down, and when Stella lifted them away, a lizard slipped from beneath one and vanished into leaves. The cover gave after she worked a rusted hinge loose with the broken awl from her tool roll below. The well was stone-lined and dark, with a circle of black water reflecting the sky as if the earth had kept one eye open. A rotten rope hung from a pulley overhead. The bucket at the bottom had not survived its own weighting. Only the rusted rim showed where it leaned against the stone, half sunk and useless. She did not drink from it. County warnings were not always mercy, but they were often experience. She lowered an old mason jar tied to twine from her sack, and brought up a little water, enough to judge. It smelled of iron, wet leaves, and something faintly sulphurous. She held it to the light, and saw flecks turning slowly in the glass. For washing, maybe after boiling, for drinking, not yet. The outhouse stood 27 steps beyond the well, and 5 more past a tangle of cane. Stella counted because counting made a place known. Its door had swollen in its frame and would not close all the way. One hinge had failed. The roof was tin, patched with tar that had cracked like dried mud. Inside a wasp nest from some earlier summer hung empty in the corner. Stella swept the seat with a branch, shook out the cobwebs, and propped the door with a brick so the wind would not swing it open while she used it. It was not comfort. It was a condition. Conditions could be improved. For 3 days she learned the forge as a person learns the floor of a room while carrying a sleeping child. She learned where the 3rd board inside the front door dipped, and where the 5th board from the west wall gave a sharp pop under her heel. She learned the brick hearth stayed damp past noon, that the east window admitted the first week's sun, that mice travelled behind the lower shelf near dusk and used the same narrow route each time. She marked the worst boards with bits of chalk made from plaster fallen near the rear wall. She set the canvas roll on the counter each morning and tied it closed each night, because habits mattered even when no one was there to witness them. She found an enamel basin under the front counter, chipped but whole, and washed it with sand, water from the well, and the end of her sleeve. She found a broom handle without bristles, then tied pine twigs around it with twine and made a broom honest enough for dust. She opened the front door after sunrise and the back door after testing its hinges, letting air pass through the rooms in a slow current. Dust lifted from corners and moved toward the light like a thing reluctant to leave. The first day she cleared the front counter. The second she sorted the shelves. The third she entered the workroom properly, not as a trespasser and not as a visitor, but as someone responsible for what her hands touched. She did not disturb the forge hearth yet. She did not pull at the chimney. She moved broken glass into a bucket, stacked rusted tins by size, and gathered old paper patterns into a wooden crate where damp could not reach them from the floor. Each task was modest. Each modest task left a visible edge between before and after. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, hunger sent her back toward town. The walk seemed shorter without the deed waiting ahead of her, though the blister on her heel had hardened into a sore ridge that rubbed with every step. She followed the county road with an empty cloth bag in one hand and $2.11 in her pocket, hoping for day-old bread, maybe beans, and, if mercy had weight, a candle. Weller & Son Hardware stood 2 blocks beyond the cafe in a brick building whose upper windows had been painted shut decades before. A bell above the door gave one tired note when Stella entered. The store smelled of seed packets, rope, oiled wood, floor wax, and galvanized nails. Narrow aisles ran between shelves so high a ladder stood on a rail behind the counter. There were bins of hinges and screws, glass jars of washers, stovepipe elbows, lamp wicks, work gloves, axe handles, brass fittings, mouse traps, sash cord, fence staples, chimney brushes, and boxes of nails labelled in a hand so exact that Stella stopped to admire the lettering. Behind the counter stood a man perhaps in his late 60s, built narrow as a fence rail, with white hair cut close to his head and eyebrows that seemed to have kept all the thickness his scalp had surrendered. He wore a brown canvas apron over a flannel shirt and had a pencil tucked behind one ear. The left lens of his glasses had a scratch across it, and when he looked at Stella he tilted his head slightly, using the clearer eye. "You are the girl who bought the Vale place," he said. It was not a question. Stella's hand tightened around the cloth bag. "Yes." "Name is Russell Weller." He tapped the counter once, not as introduction alone, but as if confirming where both of them stood. "My father's name is still on the sign. My son sells insurance in Charleston and has no use for lamp wicks." Stella nodded, uncertain whether she was meant to smile. Russell looked toward the street through the front window, then back at her. "What do you need first?" She had meant to say beans. The answer that came out was more honest. A way to clean a chimney without dying. His mouth twitched. Not quite amusement. "That is first. Then." He came around the counter and led her to the back aisle. There, hanging from hooks, were round wire chimney brushes in sizes from 6 inches to 12, extension rods stacked in bundles, canvas drop cloths, soot scoops, stove cement, gloves, masks, and goggles wrapped in cloudy plastic. What is the flu size? I do not know yet. What shape? Square, I think. The chimney served a forge hearth. Russell's face sharpened with interest. Not a parlour flue. Then? Bigger throat. Bad crown. Yes. Bird nest likely. Squirrel work. 2. Creosote if anybody burned wood after coal. You look up before you look down. Never trust a chimney that has been rained into. I figured that much. Good? Figuring is cheaper than bones. He drew a small notebook from his apron and wrote while speaking. You will need a 10-inch square wire brush, 3 rods, canvas or feed sacks to close the hearth opening while you work from above if the roof will hold. If the roof will not hold, work from below and make peace with filth. Goggles, mask, wire hand brush, cold chisel, bucket, lantern if you have one. I do not have a lantern. He added that without comment. At the counter, Stella laid out her coins. I cannot buy all that. Russell looked at the money, then at the canvas roll under her arm. I did not ask what you could buy. I asked what you needed first. She felt heat move into her face, not from shame alone, but from the danger of kindness when she did not yet know its cost. I can pay some now, she said. I will pay the rest when I work. Doing what? Anything lawful. That is a wide trade. I can clean, lift, sort, mend seams if the metal is honest. I can keep records. I can patch copper if the tear is not too far gone. Russell's clearer eye remained on her. Who taught you copper? She looked down at the counter's worn edge. Family. He did not press the bruise. He took a green ledger from beneath the register, opened it to a blank line, and wrote her name with the date. Then he wrote Vale Forge beneath it, though she had not asked him to. Store credit, he said. 30 days before I begin frowning. 60 before I speak sternly. 90 before I become Baptist about it. I do not want charity. Good. I do not offer it well. He tore a sheet from an old invoice pad and began adding figures. You will owe for goods. You will bring receipts when you can. If you cannot pay with money, you can scrape paint from the back windows here when the weather turns. That paint has mocked me since August. Stella breathed once through her nose. Yes. He slid another item across the counter. A paperback with a cracked spine and a cover showing a man in a cap repairing a porch beam. Home repair for farm buildings and outsops. The price written in pencil inside the front cover was 75T. That one is free, Russell said. It is out of date, which means half of it is still useful. She picked it up carefully. Chapter 4 lies about roof pitch, he added. Chapter 7 is good on flashing. Ignore the electrical work unless you want the Lord to recognize you by smoke. For the first round, he wrote the list plainly. 10-inch square chimney brush used, 3 tons and 25 cents. 3 fiberglass rods mismatched but threaded true, $2.10 total. Cotton work gloves, $1.40. Paper dust masks, 3 for 45.2. Goggles, scratched, $1.75. Wire hand brush, 85Ts. Cold chisel used, $1.20. Kerosene lantern with dented frame, $3. Half-pint kerosene, 62 Tagalias. Stove blacking tin, 90 Tagalias. 2 pounds 80 common nails, $1.18. 1 pound 60 finishing nails, 74 Tagalias. Roll of tar paper remnant, $2.50. Box of matches, 12 Tagalias. Small bar of lye soap, 18 Tagalias. Beans from his own back room rather than the store shelf, no price written until Stella gave him a look, and he added 40 teaspoons. The total came to $20.74, and the number sat between them like a hill. Russell turned the ledger around so she could see he had written it all. You will sign here. She signed with the pencil he handed her. Her signature looked thin beneath his columns, but it held. He packed the goods in 2 boxes and tied them with cotton twine. Then he added, without recording it, a paper sack containing 2 apples bruised on one side and a heel of cornbread wrapped in wax paper. Mrs. Weller sends too much with me, he said, though Stella had seen no Mrs. Weller and suspected he lived above the store alone. The boxes were heavy. He carried them to the door for her, but did not offer to carry them farther. She was grateful for that. Help had a shape. Too much of it could make a person disappear under gratitude. Back at the forge, she set the supplies on the front counter and began with inspection. The chimney crown could not be trusted underfoot, so the roof was not an option. From the workroom, she studied the hearth opening and smoke chamber with the lantern set on the brick floor. The hood was sheet iron, riveted along the seams, and the throat above it widened into darkness. Stella tied a dust mask over her nose and mouth, put on the scratched goggles, and wrapped a feed sack over her hair. She hung another sack across the opening to catch what fell, weighing the lower edge with bricks. It was not sealed well, but it was better than nothing. The first pass was done by hand. She reached into the lower chamber with the wire brush and scraped soot from the accessible ledges, moving slowly, withdrawing often to empty the brush into a bucket. The soot was not powder only. It came down in flakes, greasy black and shining at the edges, mixed with straw, acorn caps, and the delicate bones of some small bird that had found its way in and never found its way out. She stopped when she saw those bones. Then she gathered them on a scrap of newspaper and carried them outside to the base of the walnut tree. After that she assembled the rods. The threads were worn and had to be tightened with a strip of cloth so they would not unscrew inside the flue. She pushed the brush upward until it met resistance 3 feet above the throat. She twisted clockwise, never backward, the way Russell had warned in a note written on the invoice margin. Backward loosened rods, forward cleared obstruction. The brush bit into packed debris. Moved an inch, stopped, then moved again. Soot sifted down against the feed sack with a sound like dry sand poured slowly into a box. For 6 hours she worked in intervals because her arms trembled if she forced them too long. Push, twist, withdraw, empty. Breathe at the door, return. The chimney gave up its years reluctantly. Creosote fell in hard black plates, some curved to the shape of the flue, some thick as bark. A squirrel nest came next, dry leaves and shredded cloth and pine straw packed so tightly it held together when it landed. Then came damp soot from higher up, colder and heavier, staining her gloves through. By late afternoon her face was streaked black beneath the goggles, and her shoulders burned. She had scraped the lower smoke chamber with the cold chisel, cleared the ledges, and pushed the brush high enough to feel air moving differently through the flue. To test draft, she lit 1 twist of newspaper in a shallow pan at the hearth edge. At first the smoke wandered into the room, lazy and grey. She waited, watching without hope or despair. Then the column gathered itself and leaned upward, found the throat and vanished. The sight nearly made her sit down. The next evening, after checking the flue again and clearing one more fall of soot from the smoke shelf, Stella made the first small fire in the forge hearth. She used pine shavings, dry twigs, and 3 split pieces of branch no thicker than her wrist. Flame caught shyly at first, then with more confidence as the draught warmed. Light moved across the backroom walls, revealing tool shadows and nail heads, and the uneven surface of brick that had not seen fire in years. She set an old iron grate over 2 bricks and placed a dented pot on it. One she had found under the counter and scoured with sand until the inside looked safe enough for beans. Into it went water from town, beans from Russell's sack, a pinch of salt from a paper packet she had saved, and after a long hesitation, half the cornbread crumbled for thickness. The pot trembled as it heated. Steam rose. The smell of cooking filled the forge slowly, first as a suggestion, then as proof. She ate sitting on the brick floor with her knees drawn close. The bowl cupped in both hands because the warmth of it entered her fingers before the food reached her mouth. The beans were underdone. The cornbread had gone slightly sour. Ash had found its way into the rim of the bowl. It was still the first hot meal she had made for herself under a roof that was, in some narrow legal sense, hers. After that, the workroom changed. Not because it was clean. It was not. Not because it was safe. It was not that either. but fire had drawn a line through the cold, and Stella began to see the room less as a ruin than as an inventory waiting for hands. On the fourth morning she opened Amos's notebook to a blank page near the back and began listing what remained. Forge hearth brick needs repointing. Iron hood riveted, surface rust seams intact, hand blower seized wheel true, belt missing, coal bucket rusted bottom, contents solid, swage block copper-faced wall-mounted, surface verdigris, hollows visible, stake plate loose on bench, 4 usable holes, bench vise, screw frozen, jaws aligned, wooden mallets, 2 1 split, 1 serviceable after handle wedge. Raising stakes, 3 unknown steel condition under rust. Mandrels, 6 visible sizes varied, tinsmith snips, 1 pair spring broken. Soldering irons, 3 copper heads, handles charred but present. Rivet set, found in drawer, pounce wheel, missing handle. Chalkline reel, empty, patterns, paper, water damage at lower edge. Apron, leather, stiff, ledger fragments. Mice damage, glass jars, some nails, some rivets, some unidentified copper scraps in crate, greened but usable for practice. Brass strip, warped, tin sheet, pierced. She moved through the room item by item, touching only what she could move safely. Each object went into one of 4 groups: usable now, repair later, study first, discard only if beyond saving. The last group remained nearly empty. She did not yet trust herself to declare a thing beyond saving. Too many people had spoken that way about buildings, trades, and girls without homes. Under the west bench, she found a drawer stuck fast. It took oil, patience, and the thin edge of the broken awl to work it loose. Inside lay paper packets of copper rivets, each labelled by size, 1/8 inch, 3/16, 1/4. The writing had faded, but the careful hand behind it remained. She found a tin of powdered rosin, hardened around the edges, a spool of wire, 3 beeswax lumps wrapped in cloth, a packet of emery paper so old it cracked when unfolded. At the back of the drawer, beneath mouse-chewed sacking, lay a folded invoice from 1941 for copper sheet delivered by rail. She placed each find on the counter and wrote it down. The copper swage remained on the wall. She had noticed it first by moonlight and then in daylight as part of the room's ordinary equipment. It was broad, nearly 3 feet across, mounted at shoulder height on a backing of oak boards. Its face was not flat, but worked into shallow channels, bowls, ridges, and curved depressions used for shaping sheet metal. Unlike the steel swage blocks Amos had owned, this one had a copper working face over what she assumed was a heavy timber or iron core, made for softer forming, perhaps for delicate curves that could not bear harsher contact. Verdigris had gathered in the lower grooves. Dust lay thick along the top edge. 2 iron straps fixed it to the wall, 1 at each side, and a third ran along the bottom. On the 6th day, while sorting the wall shelf beside it, Stella dropped a small brass fitting. It struck the lower corner of the swage and rang. Not a dull sound. Not the solid, brief note of metal backed tightly by wood. It gave a hollow tone, low and contained, as if the wall had answered from behind a closed mouth. Stella stood still. She picked up the fitting and tapped another place near the centre. The sound there was dense, proper, expected. She tapped the upper left. Solid. She tapped the lower right again. Hollow. She used the handle of the chasing hammer next, not hard enough to dent, only enough to listen. Centre. Solid. Left channel. Solid. Lower right depression. Hollow, with a faint after note. She set the hammer down and ran her fingers over the surface. The verdigris hid seams, but the lower right hollow seemed different from the others, not in shape, but in temperature. It held cold longer. Along its edge, where dust had settled, she saw a dark line too exact to be accidental. A compartment was possible. So was a repair plate. So was a nest. A void. A crack. A trick of mounting. She did not let herself decide quickly. First came the weight test. She loosened nothing yet. She placed both hands beneath the lower edge and lifted gently. The swage did not move, but the right side gave the smallest answering shift, a breath of movement beneath resistance. She checked the straps. The bottom strap had 3 visible screws. 2 were rusted, nearly smooth. The third, at the lower right, was not a screw at all, but a plug coloured to match the iron around it. She cleaned around it with the awl tip. Under black paint and dust, a circular edge appeared. Wood, not metal. Cedar, by the smell released when she scraped it. A disc, perhaps the width of a quarter, set flush into the strap opening and stained dark. Stella went to the door and breathed outside air. The yard was pale and still. The walnut trees held their bare branches against the sky. Somewhere down the lane a crow called once. She looked at her hands. Soot remained in the creases no matter how she washed. The nails were worn down from scraping. Her palms had begun to harden again in the old places where a hammer belonged. Inside, she lit the lantern and set it on the bench. She did not pry with force. Cedar softens differently than oak, and the disc had been placed to hide something not to be destroyed by the first impatient hand that found it. She warmed the area with her palm. She used the point of the awl to clear the edge. She pressed inward. Nothing. She turned the disc clockwise with the ball of her thumb. Still nothing. Then she remembered old tool chests with hidden catches, the kind Amos had shown her once in a cabinet made by a man who trusted cleverness more than locks. She pressed and turned counterclockwise. The disc shifted 1/8 of an inch. A smell rose from it, faint but unmistakable. Cedar and dust kept in darkness. She worked the disc slowly until it released into her hand. Behind it lay not a screw head but a narrow iron pin with a flattened loop. She pulled. The pin resisted, then slid free with a dry whisper. Something inside the swage settled. The lower right section moved outward by less than a finger's width. Stella stepped back as if the wall had spoken. The compartment door was fitted so well that closed it disappeared into the shaped copper surface. Open, it revealed a cavity lined with cedar boards darkened by age but dry. The smell came stronger now. Cedar, paper, old cloth, beeswax, and the still air of a place sealed before she was born. Stella did not reach in immediately. She brought the lantern closer. Then she washed her hands in the enamel basin and dried them on the cleanest part of her shirt. The first package was wrapped in oiled cloth tied with linen tape. It was long and narrow, heavier at one end. Stella placed it on the bench and untied the tape without cutting it. Inside lay a set of small raising hammers, 3 of them, their heads polished from use, their handles darkened by hands. The faces were not factory new. They were better than new. One had a slightly crowned face for soft copper. One had a narrow crosspeen. One was a planishing hammer, so finely kept that even under the old oil, the face reflected the lantern in a blurred square of light. The second package held stakes wrapped separately in waxed paper, a mushroom stake, a hatchet stake, a small bic iron, and a curved, snarling iron with a handle worn to a satin finish. Each had been cleaned and oiled before being hidden away. Each had waited without complaint. The third bundle was flatter, sheets of copper, thin and carefully interleaved with brown paper. Alongside them lay 2 strips of brass, a roll of soft solder, and a folded cloth packet containing handmade rivets sorted into stitched pockets. The craft had not been abandoned carelessly by whoever had sealed the compartment. It had been preserved with deliberate hands. At the back of the cavity sat a tin box, rectangular, painted black once, now rubbed bare along the corners. Its lid had been sealed with beeswax and tied crosswise with cord. Resting on top of it was a small paper label, browned but legible, for the one who will work slowly. Stella sat down on the bench because her knees had become unreliable. The room around her remained the same. The cracked windows, the cold hearth, the dust in the corners, the roof holes admitting pale afternoon. Yet the air had changed, and she knew from the stillness in her own body that she had crossed into a responsibility greater than finding. Finding was only the door. What mattered came after. She opened the tin box with a paring knife found in the front drawer, seizing the wax away in flakes and unwinding the cord without breaking it. The lid resisted, held by age and a little rust, then gave with a soft pop as the seal released. Inside was money. Not loose at first. Bundled, wrapped, layered with paper and cloth, bank envelopes from institutions whose names had changed or vanished, a tobacco tin filled with coins, a folded handkerchief tied around more bills, a small leather purse cracked along the hinge. Stella stared until the shapes became ordinary enough to touch. She lifted the first bundle. The paper around it had an ink notation, 1928 repairs, church roof and lamps. Inside were bills, many old, some silver certificates, some Federal Reserve notes, flattened and dry. She did not know their collector value and did not think that way at first. She counted only the face amounts because hunger and shelter count plainly. 10, 20, 55, 1. She wrote each amount on a page torn from the back of the county repair log, because the notebook from the shed felt too intimate for arithmetic of this kind. The second envelope read winter kettles, 1933. The third read war orders, paid late, 1944. The fourth had no label. The leather purse held coins wrapped in cloth, Mercury dimes worn smooth at Liberty's cheek, Standing Liberty quarters with dates nearly gone, Walking Liberty $half, Indian head cents, wheat pennies in paper rolls, 3 Morgan silver dollars blackened at the edges, 2 peace dollars, and a small gold coin Stella did not recognize wrapped separately in tissue. She laid each type in rows on the bench, the way Amos had taught her to lay out rivets by size before beginning a seam. At the bottom of the tin box, beneath the money, lay a military medal in a square cardboard case. The ribbon had faded but kept its stripes. The brass had darkened. Inside the lid, in careful ink, was written 1918. No name, only the year. Stella closed the case gently. There was also a handwritten journal bound in brown leather, its cover dry but intact, and beneath it a sealed letter folded into an envelope. The envelope had no stamp. Across the front, written in a firm, slanted hand, were 4 words, "To the future hand." She did not open it. Not yet. First, she finished counting because stopping halfway would make the money unreal. The work took hours, the light faded, and she lit the lantern. Her stomach tightened from hunger, but she did not leave the bench. She counted each bundle twice, then again when the numbers did not seem possible. She separated old bills from newer ones, coins from paper, labeled envelopes from unlabeled. She did not cheer, she did not cry. Her body went quiet in a way beyond tiredness. The total came to $44,891.73. She wrote the number once. Then she placed the pencil down and covered the page with both hands. Outside, evening gathered among the trees. The forge had grown cold while she counted. The fire had gone out hours before, leaving only a grey softness in the hearth. Stella wrapped the money again in its papers, not perfectly as it had been, but respectfully. The tools she laid together on clean cloth, the medal she placed beside the journal. The sealed letter remained unopened, its 4 words facing upward in the lantern light. She knew that if she read it then, in the dark, with hunger sharpened by astonishment, and the room pressing close around her, she might not receive it rightly. Some things required mourning. Some things deserved hands washed twice, a clear eye, and the first steadiness of daylight. So she put the tin box back on the bench, weighted the papers with the smallest hammer, and went outside. The night had turned clear and colder. Stars stood above the walnut trees, bright and exact between the branches. Stella walked past the well, past the outhouse, down the slight fall of land toward the black ribbon of water she had seen on the first evening. Marsh grass whispered around her legs. The ground softened near the edge, and she stopped where the bank held. Water moved there without hurry, carrying moonlight in broken pieces between cypress knees and brown reeds. She stood a long time. No one on the road knew. No one in town knew. The county clerk did not know. Russell at the hardware store did not know. Warren did not know and would never be told. Her mother did not know, and the silence between them remained exactly where it had been left. The money did not repair that silence. It did not make the roof sound. It did not mend the chimney or make the well clean or turn a condemned building into a home by morning. It was not rescue in the way stories often pretend rescue comes. It was a keeping. Someone had wrapped tools against rust. Someone had saved coins from labor done by hand. Someone had written a journal and sealed a letter. Someone had trusted that the future might still contain a person willing to work slowly. Stella watched the water until her feet began to ache from the cold. Then she turned back toward the forge, where the lantern burned in the workroom window like a low, patient star. The forge had been waiting. So had she. This morning came with frost on the inside edge of the broken pane and a pale band of light resting across the workbench. Stella woke before the sun had cleared the walnut trees. She had slept badly, not because of fear alone, but because the sealed letter had altered the room even while it remained closed. It waited on the bench with the journal, the medal, and the wrapped tools, and she felt its presence the way a person feels another person breathing quietly nearby in the dark. She did not touch it at once. First she went outside to the well and washed her hands with water drawn in the mason jar, cold enough to make her fingers stiff. She rubbed lye soap beneath each nail, rinsed twice, and dried her hands on the least soiled part of a flour sack. Then she swept the brick before the hearth, fed a modest fire with split branches, and waited until the first smoke pulled cleanly up the chimney. She did not cook. Food could come after. The letter lay where she had left it, its envelope yellowed to the color of dry corn husk. The flap sealed not with glue, but with a dark spot of beeswax pressed flat by a thumb. The handwriting across the front was firm, slanted slightly right, and exact enough to make each letter seem set in its place rather than written in haste. To the future hand. Stella knew that handwriting before she knew why. It was not Amos's. It was older, more narrow, with a lifted tail on the H and a careful crossing of each T. She had seen it on the paper labels in the hidden compartment, on the envelopes holding old payments, on the small note resting atop the tin box. A hand like that did not belong to an office. It belonged to someone who labelled because memory mattered. She warmed the wax seal between her fingers until it softened just enough to lift without tearing the envelope. The paper inside unfolded along lines made long ago, and the sound it gave was dry and soft, like leaves turned carefully underfoot. She laid it flat on the workbench, smoothing only the corners. Then Stella read, "My dear one, whoever you are, if this letter has reached your hands, then the house has outlasted my body, my worry, and most likely my good sense. That gives me comfort. I have been told by Dr. Elias R. Whitcomb of Charleston that the illness in my blood will not be persuaded much longer by tonic's rest, or the stubbornness that has carried me farther than he expected." He spoke plainly on the 17th of October, 1952, in a narrow office on Meeting Street, while rain ran down the window behind him and a nurse folded her hands as if she could hold back the news by being still. "I'm writing because I cannot carry forward what ought not to die with me. My name is Clara Vale Merriweather, born Clara Eugenia Vale in this parish in 1886, daughter of Thomas Vale, born 1852, and his wife Ruth Ann Bell Vale, born 1859 near Shera, both makers in their own ways. My father learned brazier work from his father, Josiah Vale, who came down from Petersburg, Virginia, after the war with 2 hammers, a bent stake, and more grief than money. Josiah had learned from his mother's people, the Bowens of eastern North Carolina, who patched kettles, shaped lantern bodies, mended copper-still worms when the law allowed, and when it did not, and raised vessels for kitchens, churches, rice mills, and boats along the coast. Before Josiah there was Samuel Vale, born 1799, apprenticed as a boy in Wilmington to a tinsmith who believed a seam could reveal the character of the person who made it. Samuel's wife, Mercy, kept accounts in a Bible margin because no one had given her a ledger, and because she believed the Lord could endure arithmetic. From them came our habit of writing down what we made, who paid, who could not pay, and which tools belonged to the work rather than to the worker. You may have noticed that I write of fathers and sons, but it was not only fathers and sons. My grandmother Eliza raised lamp reflectors finer than any man in Georgetown County. My mother could set a rivet by sound. I was taught to anneal copper before I could reach the slack tub without a stool. Yet the sign outside says Vale and Sons because the world often needs a name it already understands before it will come through the door. I tell you this so you will know the truth was larger than the paint. The shop closed in truth on March 3rd, 1919. though the sign stayed up many years after, and we took repairs when hunger required. That date is exact. I wrote it in the ledger after Mr. Abner Coyle brought back the church laver we had made for St. Mark's, and said the new factory basin from Baltimore cost less than our repair. He was not cruel. He only belonged to the new time. That same week the last rice mill contract was cancelled, 2 lantern orders were withdrawn, and a travelling salesman demonstrated stamped cookware in the square, while half the town gathered around him as if he were showing them the future. Perhaps he was, for more than 30 years after that. This room heard less hammering each season. We mended when asked. We patched wash boilers, milk cans, gutters, syrup kettles, stove pipes, baptismal bowls, boat lamps, and roof flashing. We made no grand vessels. We kept the hearth warm enough to say the trade had not ended, though some winters I knew I was lying to myself with coal smoke. Silence entered the shop by inches. First the shelf where new sheet copper weighted stood bare. Then the apprentice bench went unused. Then the account book had whole months with no line written. A room can become quiet without becoming empty, remember that? My husband, Nathaniel Merriweather, was not a brazier, but had the patience of one. He repaired harness, sharpened blades, and listened better than any man I knew. Our son Peter left for France in 1918 with the 30th Division and returned with a cough that no summer cured. My younger brother, James Vale, did not return at all. His medal is in the box because my mother could not bear to see it, and could not bear to bury it. Peter died in 1923, thin as winter kindling, and Nathaniel followed in 1931 after a stroke took first his right hand and then his speech. A house can hold several kinds of absence and still ask the kettle to be filled. If you are the one who has opened the copper swage, then I must speak to your hands as plainly as I can. Copper wants patience more than strength. For vessel work, begin with sheet not thinner than 20 gauge unless you are only learning the curve. Anneal in a clean fire until the surface reaches dull red in low light near 900 Dicron height, but do not chase brightness. Quench at once if you need speed. Let it air cool if the piece is large and you fear warping. Clean scale with vinegar and salt, 3 parts vinegar to 1 part salt by measure, warmed but not boiled. Rinse well. Flux left behind will teach rust to come visiting. For a raised bowl, mark your center and scribe your circles with dividers, not guessing. Set the first course over the mushroom steak and lift the wall in rounds, turning the disc after each blow. Do not strike at the same line twice in anger. When the metal stiffens, stop, anneal again. A hard sheet under a proud hammer will split at the rim and tell everyone you hurried. Planish only after the shape is true enough to deserve polishing. Use the light hammer, close blows, overlapping by half, and listen for the note to brighten. A clean curve sings higher than a bruised one. For seams on a kettle patch, brighten both faces. Tin the iron first if you're using it near the joint. Flux lightly. Too much flux is confession before sin. Heat the work, not the solder. Let the solder flow because the copper has invited it, not because you have drowned the wound. If riveting, use copper rivets where heat and water will live together. Set them snug, not cruel. The washer should sit flat. A proud rivet catches cloth and tells on you. For brass, lower your expectation of forgiveness. It work hardens quickly and cracks when treated like copper. Anneal to a dull red no more and quench if you must, but keep the fumes away from your lungs and never breathe over the pot if you're melting solder. Zinc has no manners. Tinplate is a different creature. It asks for cleanliness, light touch, and no sermons. Burn through it once and you will remember. I have left tools because tools remember motion. I have left material because beginning is hard when the bench is bare. I have left money because roofs fail, bodies hunger, counties threaten, and pride has killed more good work than poverty ever did. Use it carefully. Do not turn it into velvet chairs, automobile chrome, or any purchase meant to prove you have been rescued. Rescue is not proof. Repair is proof. Keep account of what you spend. Keep more than you use. Whoever comes after you may also arrive cold. You may wonder why I did not give these things to kin. I had kin, though not all kin are inheritors. Some wanted land sold, some wanted the chimney brick, some wanted the word Vale without the work that made it honest. I chose instead to trust time. Time is stern, but it is less greedy than men with quick plans. Inheritance is not only blood. It is the acceptance of care from hands that may never touch yours. It is the bread left by someone who does not ask your name. It is the clerk who copies a deed correctly, though no one thanks her. It is the man who oils a tool before putting it away, because he believes some future palm will know what to do with it. If you're reading this, then you are that future palm, or you're near enough to it that I will not quarrel with heaven. Do not be ashamed if you're afraid. Fear is only the body counting the cost. Count it, then begin. Sweep first. Mend what keeps rain out, clean the chimney before trusting flame, boil the well water until you know better. Photograph repairs if officials require proof. Save every receipt. Eat before you climb, tie your hair, bank the fire, do not sleep beneath the rear roof until the rafter is sistered and the chimney made honest. Behind the house, beyond the well, there is a black walnut with an old horseshoe grown into the north side. Nathaniel set it there the summer Peter came home, saying luck ought to be nailed where it had to work for its living. Under that tree we buried filings, broken rivets, cracked handles, and the little failures of the shop. Not trash. Lessons. If the tree still stands, greet it for me. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Clara Eugenia Vale Merriweather. November 2, 1952. Stella read the letter once without moving. The fire behind her shifted and lowered. A coal broke inward with a soft sound, and a thin line of smoke drew upward through the flue. Outside, the first sun reached the upper limbs of the walnuts and turned the frost to water, drop by drop, along the branches. In the workroom, the words remained on the paper, exact and patient, neither asking for tears nor refusing them. She read it a second time. This time her fingers stopped at certain places, the line about the sign, the sentence about the world needing a name it understood, the instruction not to strike at the same line twice in anger, the warning not to sleep beneath the rear roof, the mention of someone arriving cold. Stella placed one hand flat on the bench and kept it there until the trembling in her thumb eased. Then she folded the letter along its original creases. Not new creases, not the quick folds of a person putting away paper after reading. She followed the memory already in it, matching edge to edge, letting the old shape return. She placed it back on the envelope, not inside yet, because the paper had become less a secret than a voice still in the room. The journal waited beside it. She did not open that either. The letter had been enough for one morning. After a while, Stella stood, took her coat from the peg near the front room, and went out through the back door. The air smelled of thawing leaves and cold mud. She crossed to the well, then beyond it, following the uneven ground where Cain brushed the legs of her jeans. The black walnut stood farther back than she had realized, not one of the pair at the lane, but a larger tree near the edge of the low ground, its trunk twisted and broad, its bark deeply ridged. One side faced north toward the shadowed land, and there, grown into the trunk so completely that the bark had risen around it like a slow tide, was a horseshoe. Only the outer curve showed now. Rust had darkened it almost black. One nail head remained visible, sealed in living wood. Stella did not touch it at first. She stood before the tree with both arms hanging at her sides, the way she had stood years ago beside the pecan, while Amos's tools were loaded into someone else's trailer. But this was not the same standing. Then things had been taken away. Here, something had been kept. She knelt beneath the walnut and brushed leaves from the ground. There was no marker, no stone, no name carved into bark. Only small fragments if one looked closely. A green-stained copper shaving near a root, a bit of blackened iron, a rivet head no larger than a pea, a narrow strip of brass folded upon itself by weather and time, lessons, Clara had called them. Not trash. Stella gathered none of them. They belonged where they had been placed. She laid her palm against the bark below the horseshoe. The tree was cold. Its roughness pressed into the soft places of her hand until she felt the shape of it even after she drew away. She did not say a prayer aloud. The morning did not require performance. She lowered her head once briefly, then rose and returned to the forge. Inside, she searched the front shelves until she found the candle. It had been overlooked the first days because it lay behind a cracked jar of screws, wrapped in paper that had gone brown and stiff. The candle was beeswax, thick and yellowed, stored in a tin tube with a sliding lid. Its surface held the faint honey smell of wax kept out of light. On the paper around it, In the same careful hand as the smaller labels, someone had written, Christmas Vigil, 1892, half remaining. Stella turned it in her hands. The wick was dry but intact. A candle like that had been made in another century, lit once perhaps while someone sang, or waited, or watched a winter night through these same windows. Then it had been snuffed, saved, wrapped, and kept. It had survived factory cookware, empty account books, storms, taxes, closed roads, auction notices, and mice. She almost returned it to the shelf untouched. Preservation had its own kind of respect. But the letter had not been written, so everything would remain unused. She set the candle in a dented brass holder found near the hearth, trimmed the wick with snips from the drawer, and touched it with a match. For a moment nothing happened except a small curl of smoke. Then the wick caught. The flame stood low and blue at the base before lifting into gold. Beeswax warmed slowly, releasing a faint sweetness into the workroom, gentle beneath the stronger smells of soot and damp brick. The candle did not make much light. That seemed right. Some inheritances did not blaze. They kept. Stella sat on the bench while it burned and began, without deciding to name the chain that had brought her there. The diner cook leaving a biscuit without speech. The woman at the farm supply store shaking grain dust from a canvas sack. The librarian writing the clerk's address on a checkout slip. Mrs. Pritchard sliding repair forms into a grocery bag and warning her about the rear roof. Russell Weller writing credit in a green ledger and pretending bruised apples were an inconvenience someone else had created. The old barn that had held enough warmth in its hay for one night. Even the bus driver who had lowered the door at the stop and said nothing, had carried her farther than her own feet could have managed that morning. None of them knew the whole story. That was the grace of it. People rarely do. They had not repaired her life. They had not asked to be remembered. They had done one small thing within reach. And because of those small things, Stella had lived long enough to open a hidden compartment in a forgotten forge and read a letter written before her mother was born. If you're hearing this now, maybe you know the shape of such a kindness. Maybe someone left a porch light on when you had no place to arrive. Maybe a neighbor brought soup and did not stay to be thanked. Maybe a teacher wrote your name correctly when the rest of the world was careless with it. Maybe a clerk, a nurse, a stranger at a gas station, or a person you never saw again gave you one practical mercy at the exact hour when pride could no longer feed you. If a small kindness once kept you moving, write it down in the comments. Not because the world needs a grand story every time, but because someone watching tonight may need to remember that one quiet act can carry a life farther than we can see. Stella did not have those words yet. She only had the bench, the candle, the letter, and the list of names forming silently inside her like nails set straight before building. When the flame burned low, she pinched it out with damp fingers and saved the remaining wax. Then she made herself eat, beans reheated in the dented pot, half an apple, water boiled and cooled in the enamel basin. She ate slowly, though hunger urged otherwise. Eat before you climb. Clara had written, eat before repairs, eat before fear decides for you. By afternoon, Stella had opened the journal only far enough to see the first page. The entries were dated, beginning in 1874, with names, repairs, payments, weather, births, deaths, and occasional notes on the trade. She closed it again, not from lack of desire, but because there were roof holes above the back room and a chimney crown splitting under winter. Stories could wait a few hours. Rain would not. She repacked the money in the tin box, leaving out only $3 in worn bills and a handful of common coins she could spend without harming what ought to be studied properly. The older coins, the labelled envelopes, the medal, the letter, and the journal she wrapped in clean cloth from the supply drawer. She did not put them back inside the Swage, not yet. The compartment had kept them through decades, but now she needed them near enough to guard. That night she made her bed in the front room again, farther from the rear roof, as instructed by a woman dead more than 70 years. She laid the wrapped tools beside her on one side and the tin box on the other. The letter, folded along its old creases and returned to its envelope, rested inside Amos's notebook beneath her coat. The room darkened. The candle's faint honey smell remained in the air. Outside, The walnut branches moved once in the wind and then grew still. Stella lay awake with the heirlooms beside her, not holding them, not counting them, not planning beyond morning. She listened to the buildings settle around the new knowledge of itself, and when sleep finally came, it came slowly, like a careful hand closing a door that had been left open too long. The first snow came on December 9th, though the people in town called it sleet until it began to gather honestly along the porch rail and in the hollows of the walnut roots. By morning 2.5 inches lay over the lane, thin enough for grass to show through in places, thick enough to make every broken thing on the property appear briefly forgiven. The collapsed lean-to became a white slope. The rusted tin patch along the east wall softened beneath a clean edge. Even the roof, with its sag near the chimney and its lifted shingles, looked less like a warning and more like a burden somebody had covered with a sheet. Stella did not let herself admire it for long. Snow meant melt. Melt meant water. Water meant the rear room would not wait for spring, simply because the county had once written that word in an office file. She spent the morning at the front counter with Russell Weller's old repair book open to the roofing chapter, Clara's letter folded beside it, and Amos's dividers in her hand. She read the chapter 3 times. The first time she understood only the order of things: strip what has failed, inspect the deck, replace rot, lay felt, set shingles square to the eave, flash the chimney. The second time she marked every instruction that depended on 2 people, money, or a roof that could bear weight without argument. The third time she began translating the book's certainty into the particular speech of the forge. The back roof was not large, but it was complicated by age, 12 feet wide where it tied into the main ridge, 18 feet long to the rear eave, 1 chimney piercing the plane near the center left, and 1 sagging run where the rafter had softened from years of water entering at failed flashing. She measured from the ground where she could, from inside where the rafters showed, and from a ladder borrowed from the hardware store only after testing each rung. The roof pitch was not steep, near 6 in 12, but slick with old moss and snowmelt. She would need 12 bundles of cedar shingles if cutting around the chimney wasted less than expected, 15-pound felt, galvanized roofing nails, a roll of step flashing, tar paper for temporary cover, a chalk line, 2 sister rafters, and more nerve than she wanted to admit. At Weller and Son, Russell listened while she gave the measurements from a page so carefully written that he did not interrupt until she finished. You measured twice. 4 times. Good. That means you may only be wrong once. He took down her list, muttering figures. Cedar shingles. Not asphalt. It had cedar. It also had rain indoors. I know. He looked at her over the scratched lens. Cedar takes longer. Yes. You will need stainless or hot-dipped galvanized nails. Not bright common. Cedar will shame you for cheap metal. Yes. The total in the ledger grew in a way that made her throat narrow, but she wrote each figure down. Cedar shingles, 12 bundles at $5, $80 each, with 2 partial bundles Russell found in the rear shed and priced lower because mice had nested in the paper wrap. 15-pound felt, 1 roll, $7.45. Hot-dipped galvanized roofing nails, 5 pounds, $4.10, step flashing, salvaged copper pieces from a box under the counter, $3.75. Chalk line used, 60 teaks, hatchet handle wedge, 15 teaks to, 2 lengths of rough pine for sister rafters, 8 feet each, $2.20 total. She did not buy what she could salvage. Russell approved of that without saying so. When she reached for the boxes, she disappeared into the back room and returned with a roofing hatchet. Its head was dark with age, one side a blade, the other a square hammer face, and the handle had been worn smooth by a hand long gone. My uncle carried this, he said. He roofed tobacco barns until his knees gave out. I cannot buy that. I did not price it. Mr. Weller? He died mad at a ladder and left me 6 hatchets. A man only needs 1 if he has sense, 2 if he lacks it. Take this until the roof is done. She accepted it with both hands. That afternoon, Russell sent her not home but to the cafe. Ask Doris if Mr. Klein has had his noon coffee. Doris's cafe was narrow and warm, with fogged windows and a row of pies beneath glass domes. The woman behind the counter had forearms strong from lifting cast-iron skillets and grey hair pinned with 2 black combs. She looked Stella over once and pointed toward the last booth. Ephraim Klein, Doris said. He won't answer if you call him Mr. like you're collecting tax. Ephraim Klein sat with a coffee cup near his right hand and a folded newspaper he was not reading. He was 80, perhaps more, with skin the colour of pecan shells and a white moustache trimmed thin along his lip. His shoulders had collapsed inward somewhat, but his wrists remained thick and square. A cap lay on the table beside him, its brim darkened by long use. I do not climb roofs anymore, he said before Stella had finished introducing herself. I did not ask you to. You were about to. I was going to ask whether I could pay you to tell me when I'm doing something wrong. He lifted his eyes. You cannot pay enough for that. No. He stirred his coffee, though there was nothing in it. Vale roof. Yes. Cedar. Yes. Chimney side rotted. Yes. He nodded once, as if confirming an old suspicion. I will come tomorrow. I do not take pay for standing on ground. For 11 days, Stella worked under Ephraim's eye. He arrived each morning after breakfast, walking with a cane he seemed to resent but obeyed. He never touched a ladder. He did not lift shingles. He did not climb. He stood in the yard wearing a wool coat and the old cap from the cafe table, and from that ground he saw everything. His teaching was not generous in words, but it was exact. That nail's proud. Stella pulled it. Lines wandering. She snapped the chalk again. Your ladder's hungry. She climbed down and reset the feet. Do not trust moss. She scraped before stepping. The first 2 days were stripping. She lifted failed shingles with the hatchet blade, working from the safer edge inward, dropping rotten pieces into a pile below. Some came away whole, grey and light as bark. Others dissolved in her hand. Beneath them, the decking showed black stains near the chimney and 2 boards gone soft enough for her thumb to mark. Ephraim had her cut back to sound wood rather than patch only the visible wound. Rot travels under paint, he said. The 3rd day she opened the ceiling from inside and exposed the failing rafter. It had not broken cleanly. Water had eaten it from the top, leaving the lower edge deceptively present, like a word spoken by someone who had already withdrawn its meaning. Russell's rough pine became a sister rafter, set tight alongside the old one. Ephraim instructed from below while Stella worked from a plank laid across joists, drilling pilot holes by hand so the old wood would not split. She fastened the new timber with carriage bolts Russell had found in a coffee can, washers on both sides, nuts tightened slowly until old and new sat together without protest. Not strangled, Ephraim said. Married? On the 5th day she laid felt. The roll fought her in the wind, snapping and trying to curl back on itself. She tacked the lower edge first, overlapped each course by 3 inches, and cut around the chimney with a knife sharpened on the back step. The chalk line became her law. Ephraim taught her to snap it clean by lifting straight up, not sideways, and to trust the blue line more than her tired eye. Shingling began on the 6th day. 3-stroke nail, Ephraim said. Set, drive, seat. Not tap, tap, tap until the wood bruised, not one proud swing that split cedar. Stella learned the rhythm into her wrist. She left the proper exposure, checked every 5th course, and kept the joints staggered. Around the chimney the old flashing came away in brittle scraps. The salvaged copper from Russell's box had to be flattened, trimmed, bent, and slipped into the mortar joints as step flashing. Stella did that work slowly in the back room at night, using the mushroom stake from Clara's bundle and Amos's hammer, and kneeling where bends required forgiveness. It was the first time the old tools met new necessity in her hands. By the 9th day, her knees were bruised. Her palms blistered beneath the gloves, and cold had split the skin at 2 knuckles. Ephraim said nothing about endurance. He only pointed with his cane toward a course near the chimney. Wrong face up. She stared, saw it, and removed 6 shingles without arguing. On December 19th, with the sun low and the air smelling of frozen mud, Stella drove the last nail below the rear ridge. The roofline was not beautiful in the way new construction is beautiful. It carried the slight irregularities of an aged building repaired by human hands under winter light. But the sag had lifted. The chimney stood properly flashed. The rear room no longer showed sky through its ceiling. Ephraim walked the perimeter once, looking up. Then he put his cap back on. "It will shed rain," he said. Stella rested the borrowed hatchet against her leg. That was enough praise to warm her until dark. January entered through brick. The roof held through 2 hard rains, and Stella marked each dry morning in the repair log with the restrained satisfaction of a person learning to believe slowly. But the chimney, relieved of water from above, began to show the damage water had already done. On the outside, spalling bricks had shed their faces in red flakes that gathered at the base like broken pottery. On the inside of the back room, mortar powdered under a fingertip. The crown was cracked, the upper courses loose, and the throat still scarred with creosote in pockets where the brush had not reached. A fire could draw and still be dangerous. Stella knew that now in her body, she went to Russell with a brick fragment wrapped in newspaper. He rubbed it between his fingers, then held it near the light. "Old soft brick," he said. "Do not insult it with hard Portland if you can help it. What do I use? Hydraulic lime if you can afford enough. Fire clay near the throat. Sand sharp, not beach sand. You want the mortar to give before the brick does." He wrote the mix on the back of an invoice. For exterior repointing, 1 part natural hydraulic lime, 2½ parts clean sharp sand, dampened and mixed until it held a ridge on the trowel. For firebox joints and the lower throat, 1 part fire clay, 1 part fine sand, 1 part lime, with only enough water to make it workable. No soupy mercy. Let it rest. Knock it up again. Mist the old brick first. Pack deep. Tool the joint when thumbprint firm. The words sounded like a recipe for something more durable than supper. He sold her a half bag of hydraulic lime from a torn sack, 6 fire bricks salvaged from a stove job, fire clay in a paper bag folded twice, a pointing trowel with a chipped handle, a jointer, and a stiff masonry brush. The ledger line grew again. Stella copied every cent. She had begun keeping 2 sets of records, one for the county, clean and dated, and one in Amos's notebook, where she added weather, mistakes, and the short sentences people gave her. For 3 weeks she worked in temperatures that stayed mostly in the 20s. The cold changed masonry work. Water stiffened in the bucket if left too long. Mortar slowed under her hands. Her fingers went numb every 15 minutes, and when they warmed again near the fire, pain came back into them, sharp and personal. She learned to keep 1 pair of gloves for hauling brick and another for mixing, though both became damp by noon. She learned to warm the sand indoors the night before so the mix would not seize. She learned that lime on cracked skin burned quietly and punished neglect later. The first week was removal. She raked out failed joints by hand because power tools were beyond both money and wisdom. The old mortar came away in powder near the crown and in stubborn clumps lower down, where smoke had hardened it. She brushed each joint, vacuumed what she could with a hand pump Russell had lent her, and misted the brick with water boiled the night before and cooled in the enamel basin. On a clear day, Ephraim came by, looked up at the chimney, and said, "Do not chase what still holds." Then he left before she could thank him. That became the rule. Remove failure. Do not disturb strength. The second week was rebuilding the top courses. Stella did not climb onto the roof when frost remained. She waited until the sun reached the shingles, then used a roof ladder hooked over the ridge, tied with rope through the attic framing for more assurance than beauty. Each loose brick was lifted, numbered in chalk, cleaned with the masonry brush, and reset if it had not lost too much face. The worst she replaced with old brick Russell found behind his store, mismatched but soft enough to live beside the originals. She laid them in lime mortar, tapped them level with the trowel handle, and struck the joints with care. The crown took 2 attempts. The first batch was too wet, and Russell's invoice note looked back at her from the bench with its plain rebuke, no soupy mercy. She scraped it off before it fully set, wasted half a day, and began again. The second crown sloped gently away from the flue, not elegant but sensible. She formed it by hand with a board edge and kept it damp beneath burlap for 3 days, misting it morning and evening so it would cure rather than crack. Inside, she repaired the lower throat and firebox joints with the fireclay mix. The work forced her body into awkward angles, one shoulder inside the hearth, cheek near soot-dark brick, lantern set behind her. She packed mortar deep with the narrow trowel, pressed, smoothed, and wiped excess before it hardened where smoke needed a clean path. Her hair smelled of ash no matter how she covered it. At night, when she washed at the basin, black water ran from her wrists. On January 27th, she made the test fire. Not a cooking fire, not a comfort fire, a small, deliberate stack of dry oak twigs, then 2 pieces of split branch, then 1 thicker length after the draft warmed. She opened the front door slightly to give the building air, watched the smoke gather, rise, and take the throat without wandering into the room. Outside, she walked through frozen weeds to stand beneath the chimney and look up. Smoke went clean. It lifted straight in the cold air, pale grey against a hard blue morning, then thinned above the walnut limbs until it became part of the sky. Stella stood there with her arms wrapped around herself, soot on her jaw, lime under one thumbnail, and did not move until the smoke had been rising for 20 minutes. The chimney was not finished forever. Nothing old ever was, but it had been made honest for the next season. That was the kind of victory she could trust. Only after the roof shed rain and the chimney drew clean did Stella allow herself to address the flaws. She had been walking across them for weeks with the caution of a person crossing uncertain ice, learning the creaks, marking the soft places, and stepping near nail lines where joists gave support. The front room floor was white pine, hand-planned, wide in places, narrow in others, patched across generations by boards that did not quite match. The nails were rose heads, hand-cut and dark, their heads irregular enough to catch light differently from modern wire nails. Some sat proud, some had sunk beneath a century of feet. The floor did not need replacing. It needed respect. She rented a random orbit sander from Russell for $14 a day. After promising twice that she would not let the machine sit still and gouge half-moons into the pine, he sent along 3 grits of paper, 80, 120, and 220. No coarser, he said. You are cleaning a face, not skinning a deer. Before sanding, she set every proud nail by hand. The nail set cost 35 Ts and became one of her favorite tools for its simple refusal to do more than one thing. She placed the tip on each rose head and tapped lightly until metal sat just below the surface. Where boards had lifted, she used cut nails Russell found in a drawer labeled Old Floor, matching the old fasteners as closely as possible. Splits were not hidden, they were cleaned, glued where needed, and clamped with wedges overnight. Gaps remained. A floor with no gaps in a building like that would have been a lie. The first pass with 80 grit filled the room with the smell of opened pine, dry dust, old oil, and faint smoke pulled from fibers that had held it for decades. Stella wore a mask and tied cloth over the doorway to the workroom. The sander hummed against her arms, stubborn and heavy, requiring forward motion and restraint. It revealed the boards gradually, not as new lumber but as wood returning from beneath grime. Grey lifted, black stains softened at the edges, tracks of former furniture appeared and vanished. Near the front counter where customers had once stood, the pine was worn in a crescent, and Stella sanded that place lightly, because use had already polished it more honestly than paper could. The second pass, 120 grit, was quieter. She worked with the grain, knees stiff, back aching, stopping often to sweep and inspect. The third, 220, felt almost like apology. By then the floor had changed colour from dead grey to dark honey in the lighter boards and something near mahogany where old oil and soot had travelled deep. No stain was needed. Time had done that work. For finish, Stella chose oil because varnish would have made the floor too sealed, too shiny, too much like a museum where no one was meant to live. Russell sold her tung oil cut with citrus solvent for the first coat and boiled linseed oil for later touch. warning her 3 times about oily rags and fire. She listened. She spread each rag flat outside on a line of wire until dry, then stored them in a metal-lidded pail. No folded rag would burn the forge down after all it had endured. The first coat darkened the pine at once. Stella applied it by hand with cloth, working board by board, watching the grain rise into visibility. 48 hours to cure, Russell had said. She gave it 50. The second coat went thinner, the third thinner still. Between coats she moved through the room in socks, if the air was warm enough, and watched light from the front window travel across the boards in a slow rectangle. On one bad morning, she did no work at all. It came without drama. She woke before dawn with her hands aching, her shoulders heavy, and the ledger figures sitting in her mind like stones. The floor needed another coat. The county log needed updating. The back wall still had rot near the sill. The well water had not been tested. The chimney needed one more exterior joint checked after freeze. She sat up, looked at the tools arranged beside the wall, and could not make her body reach for any of them. So she took her coat and walked to the marsh. The air was flat and grey. Ice rimmed the shallow edges where water gathered between grass clumps. She found a place on a fallen log near the black ribbon of water and sat with her hands tucked into her sleeves. After a while, a great blue heron lifted from the reeds without sound. It rose slowly, broad wings beating with a grave, unhurried strength, legs trailing behind like 2 dark lines. It crossed the water and settled farther downstream, folding itself back into stillness, as if flight had been only a brief correction. Stella watched the heron for nearly an hour. She did not turn the moment into a lesson. She did not tell herself rest was useful so she could excuse it. She simply remained there, cold and breathing, while the marsh went on making its small winter sounds. When she returned to the forge, she ate, warmed her hands, and did not open the oil tin until the next day. The floor waited. So did she. By the end of January, the front room had a surface that could be swept clean, slept on without newspaper, and crossed at night without fear if one remembered the 2 boards near the east wall. Stella placed the old counter back on blocks to level it. She set the repaired chair near the window. Then she stood in the doorway at dusk and looked at the boards holding lamplight. The room had not become grand. It had become habitable. There was a deeper mercy in that. February asked for glass. The forge had 8 windows altogether, and Stella had avoided giving them full attention while roofs and chimneys and floors made louder demands. But cold entered through every failed pane with a thin, deliberate persistence. Rain had blown through the west side twice. Dust gathered where wind found cracks. At night, the broken windows made the building feel less closed than paused. She counted them on the first clear morning of the month. 3 had no glass at all, only jagged teeth in the muntins and old putty hardened like bone. 4 were cracked, each differently, one with a single diagonal line from corner to corner, one starred from a stone strike, one split along the lower edge, one holding together only because someone long ago had pasted brown paper across it. The last window, high on the east wall of the workroom, remained whole. Its glass was wavy, faintly green at the thick places, and old enough that the view through it bent the walnut branches slightly out of true. Scratched into the lower sash near the right corner were the numerals 1788. Stella would not replace that pane. Russell confirmed what she already suspected. Cylinder glass, maybe older than the building's last repair. Leave it be unless it falls into your hand. I need putty. DAP 33 will do for the others. Not perfect history. Good weather. History can forgive dry bedding if rain stays out. He sold her glazing points, a putty knife with a flexible blade, a small tub of DAP 33 glazing compound, 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, and salvaged panes taken from storm windows he had removed from a house near the river. None matched exactly. Stella chose by thickness, then by size, then by which imperfections felt least dishonest beside the old walls. The first window took an entire day. She laid a blanket under the sash to catch falling glass, removed shards with gloved hands, and softened the old putty by patience rather than heat because the wood was too dry to trust with a flame. The putty knife slipped twice and skinned her knuckles. She cleaned the rabbits, brushed away dust, and painted a thin coat of oil where bare wood would otherwise drink moisture from the new compound. Russell had taught her that over-the-counter using a scrap frame, and a finger lifted in warning. Dry wood steals oil from putty. Then putty fails. Feed the wood first. She kneaded the glazing compound until it warmed under her palm. It smelled faintly of oil and chalk, clean in a practical way. She rolled it into a rope, pressed it into the rabbit as bedding, set the pane gently, and pushed glazing points into place with the putty knife every 8 inches, more near corners where the sash had warped. Then came the outside bevel. Hold the knife at an angle, draw steadily. Do not fuss until the line becomes worse from improvement. Tool the corner, remove excess. Leave a clean slope so water will run away. Her first bevel was uneven. She scraped it out and did it again. The second looked less ashamed of itself. By the third window, her hand began to understand the pressure. By the 5th, she could feel when the putty had warmed enough. By the 7th, she had stopped holding her breath on the long draw of the knife. She labelled each repaired sash in the county log with date, pane source, and condition, then took photographs with a disposable camera bought from the pharmacy, because the county required visible proof and she did not own a working phone. The woman at the pharmacy had explained the flash twice and slipped an extra envelope for prints into the bag. The sash cords were a different lesson. Only 2 windows still had weights inside the pockets, and the cords had rotted to dark threads. Russell showed Stella the figure-8 knot at the counter, using twine around a bolt, not a granny knot. Not hope. Figure-8. It jams clean and comes loose when asked properly. At the forge, Stella pried off the narrow trim with a thin bar, and more caution than force. Inside the sash pocket, the counterweight hung low, cold iron shaped like a long rounded loaf. She cleaned the pulley, fed the 1/4 inch cotton cord over it, tied the figure-8 knot through the weight's eye, and tested the rise by hand before setting the trim back. The first sash stuck halfway and had to be planed lightly along one side. The second rose so smoothly she laughed once, a small sound that surprised her and seemed to surprise the room as well. The original east window she touched only enough to protect. She cleaned the frame with a soft brush, cleared loose debris, and pressed new putty into one failing lower corner without disturbing the glass. Through it, the outside world remained slightly warped, as if the past insisted on being seen through its own thickness. Stella liked that. Straight lines were not always truer. The last window was on the west wall of the front room. She had saved it for the afternoon because the light there was better after noon. The old pane had cracked in 3 places and rattled whenever the wind moved across the yard. She removed it in sections, laying each piece on newspaper before measuring the salvaged replacement. The sash was warped, so the pane required careful trimming with a glass cutter Russell had lent her after making her practice on scraps behind the store. Score once, do not saw support both sides. Snap downward with courage, not violence. The glass broke clean. She bedded it, set the points, and drew the putty bevel in one continuous line. Outside the window, a chickadee landed on a walnut branch close enough for her to see the tiny black cap of its head and the quick, precise movement of its feet around the twig. The bird turned once toward the glass, untroubled by her presence, then dipped its head and took something invisible from the bark. Stella held the putty knife still. For the first time since buying the forge, she could stand inside the front room and feel the wind remain outside. Not entirely old buildings breathe, but the sharp draughts had been reduced to murmurs. The repaired panes held the afternoon light in uneven squares across the oiled pine floor, and each square seemed to say that the room had consented a little more to being lived in. She cleaned the knife, sealed the tub of putty, and wrote the final window entry in the log before dusk. 8 windows inspected. 7 repaired. 1 original preserved. Then she sat in the chair near the west wall and watched the chickadee return once more to the walnut branch. Small and exact against the winter light. By late February, the walls began to show what winter had hidden in shadow. The roof no longer admitted rain, the chimney no longer bled smoke into the room, and the windows held against wind, so the plaster could no longer pretend its failures belonged only to weather. 3 patches near the chimney had loosened where old leaks had travelled down behind the finished coat. One had bowed outward in a pale blister. Another had cracked in a map of fine lines from the corner of the rear opening. The third had already fallen, revealing hand-split oak lath beneath, each strip narrow, rough, and fastened with little dark nails that had held longer than many promises. Stella stood before the exposed lath with the lantern in her hand and felt the restraint of not replacing what could be repaired. The plaster was horsehair plaster, original in most places, made by someone who had mixed lime, sand, water, and hair into a material that could breathe with the building rather than seal it shut. In the broken areas, pale strands still held inside the old plaster, curved and tough after more than a century. The wall had not failed because it was weak. It had failed because water had been allowed to visit too often. Russell had a bag of horsehair in the back of the hardware store, though he almost seemed embarrassed to admit it. "Came from my father's stock," he said, setting the dust-grey paper sack on the counter. 1950s, maybe? I kept it because throwing it away felt like arguing with a dead man. Stella opened the bag and pinched a small amount between her fingers. The hair was dry, clean enough, and still strong when pulled. "Will it work?" "It will if you do," he wrote the mix plainly. Lime putty if she could slake it properly, sharp sand screened fine, horsehair teased apart so it would not clump, and enough water to bring the plaster together without making it slump. Scratch coat first, pressed through the lath keys and scored while damp. Brown coat next 3/8 of an inch, floated flat and given 72 hours. Finish coat last 1/8 of an inch, smooth but not vain. Stella removed loose plaster with a putty knife, never farther than necessary. She brushed dust from the lath, misted it, and pressed the first scratch coat into place with both patience and force, working the plaster between the strips until it bulged behind them in keys that would grip when set. She scored the surface with a scrap of broken comb, leaving shallow lines for the next coat to catch. The brown coat was heavier. She applied it on a clear morning, measuring thickness with a marked stick and smoothing it with a wooden float Russell had lent her. It did not look finished. That was its purpose. It held the wall's shape, corrected the worst hollows, and waited. For 3 days she misted it lightly and kept the room from drying too fast by hanging damp cloth nearby. The final coat went on thin, almost tenderly, and when she drew the trowel over it, the repaired patches did not vanish. They belonged. A future eye would see where care had entered. Stella stood back after cleaning her tools and said softly, "Not to the room exactly, but not only to herself either. These patches will hold another 100 years." The wall did not answer. It only held. Doris began leaving paper bags on the porch in the second week of March, though Stella did not learn it was Doris until the third bag. The first appeared at sunrise beside the front door, folded tight at the top and weighted with a jar of peach preserves. Inside were 2 biscuits, a heel of ham wrapped in wax paper, 3 carrots, and a note written on the back of a cafe order slip. "For cold mornings." There was no name. The second bag held day-old rolls, onions, and a jar of soup so thick it did not spill even though the road in was rutted. The third held coffee grounds, 4 eggs packed in newspaper, and a wedge of cake that had broken on one side. Stella carried that bag to town, set it on Doris's counter, and waited until the cafe owner looked up from wiping a table. "I need to pay you." Doris did not pause. "No? I can work." "You are working." "Not for you. Not yet." Stella placed the empty jar on the counter. "I cannot take food without account." Doris looked at the jar, then at Stella. The cafe was between breakfast and lunch, the air rich with bacon grease, coffee, and warm yeast. Outside, rain traced the window glass in slanted lines. "When the shop reopens," Doris said, "you can pay me in candles." "I do not make candles." "You will learn something. That may take a while." "I have waited longer for worse." From then on, Stella returned every jar clean, every sack folded, and every order slip note saved inside Amos's notebook. Doris never mentioned the bags again. She only began setting aside trimmings, bruised fruit, and end pieces of bread as though the practice had always existed and required no speech. Caleb arrived with a splitting maul over one shoulder and a Schwinn bicycle lying in the ditch behind him. He was 15, perhaps 16, all elbows and seriousness, with a cap pulled low and a jacket too large at the wrists. Stella found him near the woodpile one Saturday morning, studying the rounds she had dragged from a fallen limb. "You need that split smaller," he said. "I know. You have a maul." "No?" He nodded, as if confirming his reason for existing there, without asking. She set one round upright and split it clean in one strike. The sound travelled through the yard, sharp and satisfying. He worked for an hour, then 2, setting the pieces in a stack with the bark side up so rain would shed. When Stella brought out coins, she stepped back. "My mother said no." "Your mother said about what?" "About your grandfather." Stella's hand closed around the coins. Caleb looked toward the lane, embarrassed by the weight of an adult sentence he had been asked to carry. "She said he fixed our kettle after Daddy died and would not take money because she had 3 children and no stove that held heat. She said I was going to split what you needed and come home." "What is your mother's name?" "Lena Price." Stella wrote it later in the notebook because some accounts were not paid with money and still needed keeping. Caleb returned on 2 more Saturdays. He split wood, carried broken shingles to the burn pile, and once repaired the bicycle chain at the porch step with such concentration that Stella suspected he preferred machines to conversation. She gave him hot beans in a tin cup, and he accepted those because food did not seem to violate his mother's terms. Reverend Boyd passed every morning at nearly the same hour. He was pastor of the narrow white church Stella had passed on the road, and he walked with a cane that clicked against stones in the lane. At first he did not come up to the porch. He simply passed the mailbox, tipped his hat toward the forge, and continued along the road as though the act of passing were part of his office. On the 4th morning, Stella was outside carrying ashes from the hearth when he stopped. "Morning," he said. "'Smorning?" "Sir." He was a tall man made spare by age, with deep brown skin, silver hair, and a long black coat that moved around him like a slower shadow. His eyes did not pry. They rested. "You are keeping smoke clean now." "I'm trying." "Trying leaves tracks." After that, each morning he paused at the lane, tipped his hat, and said the same 4 words. "Lord, keep this house." He did not raise his voice. He did not ask to come in. He did not make Stella answer. The prayer remained small enough to receive, and because of that, it entered the day without crowding it. Stella postponed the cellar until February 11th, and then postponed it again until the afternoon, because daylight mattered underground. The entrance lay beneath a trapdoor in the front room, hidden partly by a warped mat and partly by her own reluctance. She had found the ring pull weeks earlier while sweeping, cleaned around it, lifted the edge an inch, smelled damp stone and closed it again. Roof first, chimney first, windows first. Fear could be patient when necessity was louder. When she finally opened it, the hinges complained but held. The air rising from below was cold and mineral, carrying the smell of fieldstone, old earth and wood that had stayed dry only by grace. 7 granite steps descended into darkness, each worn hollow at the center. Stella set the lantern on the first step, then the second, then carried it down with one hand on the wall. The cellar was 12 feet by 15, floored in packed earth and fieldstone, with walls laid from irregular rock fitted by iron endurance. Cobwebs hung in the corners. 2 shelves remained along the north wall, empty except for a broken crock, and 3 blue glass bottles filled with dust. The ceiling beams showed no fresh rot, though one had old powder post beetle tracks. She tapped it with the awl handle, listened, and marked it for watching rather than panic. At the center of the cellar floor lay a single dressed granite slab, different from the fieldstone around it. It was rectangular, 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, set flush with the earth. On its face, someone had carved a craft mark, a shallow bowl shape crossed by a hammer and framed by 2 small arcs like handles. The carving had gathered dust in its lines. Stella knelt beside it and brushed the surface clean. The slab did not belong to storage. It had been placed. It had intention. She set both hands along one edge and felt the weight of it before lifting even a fraction. Then she stopped. Not everything found required opening. Not yet. The roof had taught her that hidden damage could punish haste, and Clara's letter had taught her that the future was sometimes entrusted by delay. Stella stood, wiped her hands, and left the slab where it was. On the stairs going up, her boot struck something that did not sound like stone. She lowered the lantern and saw, wedged beneath the third step where Shadow had kept it, a small oak box no wider than her hand. It had been pushed far back into a notch between the stair support and the cellar wall. The lid was swollen but not locked. Stella carried it upstairs before opening it, because some discoveries deserved air. Inside lay a brass key and a tin-type photograph wrapped in linen. The key was dark with tarnish, its bow shaped like the same craft mark carved into the granite slab, bowl, hammer, 2 arcs. It was too ornate for an ordinary door and too carefully made for chance. Stella turned it once in her palm, then placed it on the mantel where she could see it from the workbench. The photograph showed a young woman standing before the forge in summer light. She was 25 perhaps, straight-backed, dark-haired, wearing a work apron over a pale dress with the sleeves rolled. In her right hand she held a raising hammer. Behind her the old sign was clearer than Stella had ever seen it. Vale and Sons Brazier work. The woman's face startled her enough that she set the photograph down. Not identical. Life does not copy itself so simply. But the eyes, the line of the cheek, the guarded mouth waiting before speech. All of it came close enough that Stella reached for the bench to steady herself. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, Eliza Vale, daughter of Josiah Vale, age 25, summer of 1903. Stella read the line twice. Then she placed the photograph beside Clara's letter, not as proof of blood, not as claim, but as one more thread in a cloth too large to see at once. The key stayed on the mantel. She did not yet know what it opened. By March the snow retreated into ditches and shaded roots, leaving the yard wet, uneven, and alive with small beginnings. The creek below the forge grew loud with snowmelt, though locals would have called it a run and corrected her gently if she gave it too grand a name. Water hurried between cypress knees, carrying leaves, foam, and thin sticks toward the marsh. Walnut catkins appeared like green-brown tassels, and the first weeds pushed through the ash pile behind the lean-to. The forge changed by degrees. Morning light entered cleaner through repaired glass. Smoke rose without shame. The floor could be swept, the plaster dried pale and firm near the chimney. The roof shed a late rain so thoroughly that Stella stood in the back room listening to water run outside instead of in, and the sound felt like a kindness performed by wood, nail, and cedar. People in town began to speak of the place not as the condemned property but as the Forge Road place, then sometimes simply as Stella's place. She did not correct either version. Names, like repairs, took time to set. She did not begin the craft that spring. The tools waited on cloth, the copper sheets remained wrapped. The journal opened slowly, an entry or two each evening, never more than she could properly hold. Stella had thought the moment of discovery might lead at once to making, but the work of keeping rain out had taught her humility. A trade was not revived because a person wanted it. It returned only when the hand was ready to serve usefulness without vanity. She decided instead to order small practice materials with one common coin from the cache, a coin worn enough to have no obvious collector value and ordinary enough not to disturb the larger keeping. She would buy scrap copper from Russell, practice seams, raise shallow dishes, ruin some, learn from each failure, and write down the result. The money would not become escape. It would become time, roof, food, record, and if earned slowly, a beginning. By April, the lane softened with new grass down the centre. Doris's bags became less frequent because Stella now had beans, flour, onions, and a little paid work scraping windows at the hardware store. Caleb came once to sharpen them all and stayed to watch Stella anneal a palm-sized copper scrap in the forge hearth. Reverend Boyd still passed in the mornings, though now his 4 words seemed less like a plea and more like a greeting to a place answering back. The house was patient. So was she? 2 winters later. In December 2024, Stella completed the first piece she allowed herself to call finished. It was not large, a shallow copper basin, 9 inches across, raised from a flat disc over the mushroom stake Clara had left behind, annealed 7 times, pickled in warm vinegar and salt, planished with Amos's hammer, and finished along the rim with a folded wire edge that took 3 attempts before it lay clean. The basin had no ornament beyond the marks of proper making. Its curve was modest, its foot ring steady, its surface bright but not polished into vanity. When filled with water, it held without weeping. When set on the workbench, it sat level. When lifted, it carried the weight of the hands that had taught her without being present to see it. She made it for use, not display. Doris took it first, though she pretended she was only borrowing it for the cafe counter. She filled it with wrapped peppermints during Advent and placed a folded card beside it, hand-raised copper by Stella Hollis, Vale and Daughters, Brazier work. Stella saw the card only after a customer had already asked whether orders could be placed after Christmas. Doris looked at her across the cafe and lifted one shoulder. Candles would have been nice, she said. Copper will do. The interior of the forge by then had become itself again without becoming new. The front room held the repaired counter, 2 chairs, a narrow table for writing orders, and shelves cleaned and lined with brown paper. The oiled pine floor had darkened under another year of use, showing the path from door to counter to workroom in a gentle sheen. The plaster patches near the chimney had cured lighter than the surrounding wall, but no one who entered seemed troubled by that. The old calendar remained in a drawer, saved. The cracked leather apron hung on its peg, not worn but honoured. The east window with the 188 scratch caught morning light in its green thickness, and bent the world outside just enough to remind Stella that straight seeing was not the only kind of truth. The back room held work again. Not much, not too much, a low fire when needed. The hand blower repaired with a new belt Caleb helped fit, the vice freed, cleaned and oiled. Steaks set in a rack Russell and Ephraim designed between them and then argued about for 20 minutes in a way that meant affection, though neither would have named it. The copper swage remained on the wall, the cedar disc replaced but not disguised from Stella's eye. She opened the compartment rarely now, only to check for dryness, to add a note, or to sit with the knowledge that some forms of safety were made by hidden care. The brass key from the oak box stayed on the mantel for nearly 2 years before she found its lock. It happened after a hard rain in early December, when the ground around the large black walnut softened and a piece of bark sloughed from the north side below the horseshoe. Stella had gone out to check whether water was pooling near the roots. She noticed a line of greenish metal beneath the fresh wound in the bark, not part of the horseshoe, and not a nail. The tree had grown around it so completely that only the rain-darkened edge showed. She fetched a soft brush, the awl and a lantern. Though it was afternoon, she did not cut living wood. She cleared only the loosened bark and soil collected in the crevice. Slowly, a brass plate appeared, set into a hollow that someone had made long ago in the trunk when it was smaller, then covered so the tree would close around it. At the center of the plate was a keyhole shaped unlike any house lock she had seen. The bow of the brass key matched the carved mark in the cellar slab. Bowl, hammer, 2 arcs. Her hand shook enough that she had to set the key down once and begin again. It turned on the second try. The brass plate released not outward but downward, hinged at the base, revealing a narrow cavity lined in tin and sealed from the weather by a bead of old wax now cracked, but still partly faithful. Inside lay a folded flag and a note wrapped in oilcloth. The flag had 48 stars, cream-darkened with age, its red stripes muted by time. It was folded tight and square, not ceremonially exact in the military way, but carefully by hands that wanted it to sleep without harm. The note was dated November 11th, 1919. Stella recognized the hand from the photograph inscription. Solder, perhaps? More formal. To the one who finds what the tree has kept. My name is Eliza Vale, daughter of Josiah. and I place this flag here on the first anniversary of the armistice for my brother James, who died in France, and for Peter Merriweather, who came home carrying the war in his lungs. The town has paraded today, and men have spoken in the square. I do not quarrel with them, but I have folded this cloth here, because grief also requires a private place where speeches cannot reach it. If the shop continues, remember them with work done honestly. If it closes, remember them by keeping this house from becoming ashamed of silence. If someone comes after us with hands willing to mend, let that person know our dead were not only names in a church paper. They were boys who ate peaches in summer, tracked mud across clean floors, laughed at the wrong moments, and believed every train would bring them home. Do not spend remembrance all at once. Evie. Stella read the note under the walnut tree with rain still dripping from the branches. Then she carried the flag, the note, and the brass plate inside, not because the tree had failed, but because its long keeping had finally been answered. She dried the oilcloth, wrapped the flag in clean muslin, and placed both inside the tin box beside the 1918 medal. The following November 11th, she took the medal to the cemetery behind the narrow white church on the county road. Reverend Boyd walked with her, slower than before but steady, and Caleb came too, taller now, with his Schwinn traded for an old truck that rattled at idle. Doris closed the cafe for 1 hour and arrived wearing a dark coat with flower on one sleeve. Russell brought a small American flag from the hardware store display and said nothing about the price. The grave for James Vale was only a memorial stone. His body had not come home. The name had weathered but remained legible. Reverend Boyd said a prayer so brief the wind nearly carried it away. Stella placed the medal in its old case on the stone, for the length of that prayer, then lifted it again because some objects are honoured by being kept, not abandoned to rain. She did not speak. She had no speech large enough for boys who had eaten peaches in summer and believed every train would bring them home. The money in the tin box changed less than people might have expected. Stella spent only what allowed the forge to stand, and even then she favoured earnings, credit repaid, barter and repair over easy withdrawal. 3 silver coins were sold through a reputable dealer Russell knew in Charleston, each documented, each chosen, because its value as coin could serve the building without wounding the record. 1 old bill, too damaged to preserve properly and common enough after appraisal, paid for a water test, a new well cap, and a hand pump repair. A few ordinary coins bought copper scrap for practice. The rest remained wrapped, labelled and sealed with updated notes in Stella's hand. She did not keep the cash secret from greed alone. She kept it from becoming a story other people could spend in their minds. The money was not a windfall, it was a responsibility with numbers. She opened a bank account for the operating funds she earned, not the old reserve. She paid Russell's ledger down slowly, in cash, labour, and 1 repaired copper kettle. He refused to price correctly. She photographed the contents, wrote an inventory, and placed a copy with Mrs. Pritchard, who had retired but still came to the clerk's office on Fridays because the younger staff did not align the file drawers to her satisfaction. When Stella tried to explain that most of the hidden money would remain for whoever came next, Mrs. Pritchard looked at her over the same beaded glasses chain and nodded. "Good," she said. A person should not eat all the seed corn just because winter ended. The forge reopened quietly. Not with a ribbon. Not with an article in the paper. Not with a crowd gathered in the yard. The first notice was an index card pinned to the corkboard at Doris's cafe between piano lessons and a church rummage sale. Vale and Daughters Brazier work. Hand-raised copper. Careful repairs. Small vessels. Lantern reflectors, kettle patches, orders by patients only. Inquire by mail or at Doris's counter. Doris added the final line herself. Stella considered removing it, then did not. The mailing list began with 7 names. By spring it held 43. Not all became customers. Some wrote because their grandmother had owned a copper wash boiler. Some asked whether a dented pan could be mended. 1 woman from Beaufort mailed a church croûte wrapped in towels and included a letter about her late father who had polished it every Easter. A man from Asheville sent a lantern reflector and 4 pages of apology for its condition. Stella answered each letter by hand. She gave prices plainly. She refused work she could not do honestly. She sent back what needed a different craftsperson, with names when she knew them. The work grew, but not beyond the room. Stella guarded that. A trade could be smothered by success as surely as by neglect. She made mornings for repair, afternoons for practice, evenings for records. On cold days she banked the fire as Clara had instructed. On warm days she opened both doors and let air move through the rooms, carrying the sound of hammer over copper out into the walnut yard. Caleb returned one Saturday in late summer with a long object wrapped in a quilt. He was no longer the boy who had arrived with a splitting maul over his shoulder and embarrassment in every sentence. He had grown into his hands. They were nicked, capable, and stained with walnut dust. He set the bundle across 2 chairs in the front room and unwrapped it without ceremony. It was a wooden sign, hand-carved from a plank of white oak, the letters deep enough to hold shadow. He had followed the shape of the old sign but not copied it entirely. The ampersand was broad and graceful. The word daughters had been carved with particular care, each letter clean, plural, and unapologetic, along the lower edge, almost hidden unless one stood near. She had carved the craft mark, bowl, hammer, 2 arcs. Stella touched the edge of the plank. Caleb, my mother said it was time. Your mother says many things through you. She's usually right. I need to pay you. He shook his head once. You already did. No, I did not. He looked toward the workroom, where a copper kettle from his mother's kitchen sat repaired and shining softly on the bench. You made that hold water. That sentence crossed the years so cleanly that Stella had to turn toward the window. They hung the sign together above the porch with Russell supervising from the ground and Ephraim, now walking less often, seated in a chair Doris had ordered someone to carry into the yard. Reverend Boyd came by in time to tip his hat. Mrs. Pritchard arrived late with a folder under one arm and claimed she was only passing, though no road useful to her led past the forge. When the sign settled against the front gable, covering the ghost of the older one but not erasing it, the building seemed to take a longer breath. No one clapped. That would have been too much. Doris said, Looks proper. Ephraim said, Left side wants another screw. Russell said, He is right. So Caleb climbed back up and set another screw. That autumn, Stella began writing her own letter. She did not know who would read it. She did not know whether the future hand would arrive by family, sale, accident, mercy, or some other route no living person could name. She only knew that the practice of keeping required a voice as much as a box, and that tools without instruction could become relics instead of invitations. She sat at the front counter in the evening after the day's fire had lowered. The oiled pine floor held amber light. The repaired windows reflected the room back at itself. On the bench behind her lay the journal, Clara's letter, Eliza's note, Amos's notebook, and her own ledger with 2 years of expenses, repairs, failures, weather, orders, and names. She chose heavy paper from the stationer in town, sharpened a pencil first to draft, then filled her fountain pen with blue-black ink Mrs. Pritchard had given her from an unopened bottle found in a retired clerk's drawer. At the top of the page, she wrote the same opening words, My dear one, whoever you are. Then she stopped and listened. The forge had many sounds now, fire settling, water in the kettle. A mouse somewhere beyond the wall, still convinced the building belonged partly to him. Wind moving past sealed windows instead of through broken ones. The faint tick of cooling copper on the bench. Outside the walnuts dropped their leaves in slow, dry turns. Stella wrote of Amos, but not too much. She wrote of Clara, Eliza, Russell, Doris, Caleb, Reverend Boyd, Mrs. Pritchard, Ephraim, and the unnamed hands that had made lath, mixed plaster, set brick, carved stone, and saved what others might have sold. She wrote down the well depth, the chimney repair mix, the roof measurements, the source of the cedar shingles, the location of the cellar slab she had still not lifted, and the warning not to hurry toward hidden things simply because they were hidden. She wrote that money can help a roof hold but cannot teach a hand to be honest. She wrote that silence is not always abandonment. Sometimes it is storage. Before sealing the unfinished pages into a temporary envelope, she added one line near the bottom: "Spend care before you spend coin." The final page would come later. She was not old, and the house had not asked for farewell. It had asked only that she begin the next keeping while her hand was steady. In winter evenings, when orders were done and the hearth carried a low red fire, Stella sometimes opened the copper swage and checked the cedar-lined hollow. The original bundles were no longer there in the same arrangement. Time had moved. The tools lived on the bench now. The journal stayed wrapped but accessible. The medal and flag rested in the tin box with their notes. The money remained accounted for, most of it untouched. Beside it, in a new cloth packet, Stella had placed the first practice bowl she had ruined, split at the rim from one impatient course of hammering. She labelled it plainly, "Struck twice in anger." Lesson kept. The forge waited. It had always waited. It waited through factory cookware, closed roads, county files, storm seasons, silence, and the long years when no one came up the lane except animals, wind and boys daring one another near condemned walls. It waited through Stella's first night on the floor, through the smoke test, the hidden compartment, the letter, the roof, the chimney, the floors, the windows, the plaster, the cellar, the key, the sign. It waited not as a miracle waits to astonish, but as a good tool waits in a drawer, holding its usefulness until a hand arrives with enough humility to ask. And in the clerk's office downtown, inside a drawer Mrs. Pritchard still inspected whenever she visited on Fridays, there remained a $5 bill with a taped corner, flattened beneath the receipt tray. The younger clerks had tried twice to move it into petty cash. Mrs. Pritchard had moved it back both times without explanation. Some records were official. Some were kept.